Welcome to another MassMEDIC program. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rachel Robinson. I'm the Vice President here at MassMEDIC, and we are absolutely thrilled to have all of you joining us for a 4-hour FDA program today. We know that's a ton of content, and you'll probably feel the need to jump on and off. Feel free to stick with us throughout it. You're really going to want to hear what's coming towards the end of the program. But again, really excited to have all of you here, and absolutely thrilled to be sharing this with you. So before we kick things off, I just want a few quick reminders. If you do have questions, there is a Q&A option through the panel. Please feel free to send your questions in throughout each of the sessions. I believe each of the speakers and panelists will be taking Q&A toward the end of their session. So please feel free to add those in as you think of them. The other thing to think about is we will be doing some quick surveys and polls throughout the event. We absolutely encourage your participation in that. So we'll announce those when they're going to happen in between sessions, and it'll just take a quick few minutes of your time. So with that, I am going to kick things over to Brian Johnson.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everybody for joining us today at our MassMEDIC FDA mid-year update. This is an exciting new twist on an annual tradition. We typically hold 2 regulatory programs every year with our friends at the ASQ Medical Device Discussion Group New England Division and RAPS Boston chapter. And thank you to our friends over there for helping us do this program. We've been doing an FDA program at MassMEDIC for more than, I believe, 25 years. I think the first program we ever held at MassMEDIC was an FDA program. So it's a long tradition here, and one we're really thrilled to continue with an incredible group of experts, insiders, and people who really understand the regulatory process. I want to make sure that we thank our incredible content partners on this program, Viva MedTech, ML Strategies, RQM Plus, Covington and Berlin, and Dwayne Morris. These folks have helped us create and curate this content today, and they've done an incredible job of putting together programming that we think is going to help you in not only your job today, but coming up shortly. I also want to put some notes on your calendar. We have next week coming up, actually 2 weeks, I believe, our town hall, where we'll have House Ways and Means Committee Chair Richie Neal. He's an incredibly important lawmaker for the medical device industry and for the country at large. The House Ways and Means Committee is very influential and important into how our country spends its money. So we're going to have him along with some experts from RQM Plus on that program. And we look forward to hosting all of you over there. And then some more housekeeping notes. What we're going to have also is we're going to have this session is being recorded, and we'll have this plus the slides available shortly to all of our attendees today. So our first session today is a conversation with Dr. Jeff Shuren with Viva MedTech Seth Goldenberg. So we are actually waiting for Dr. Shuren to join. He's a busy guy, so I think he might be taking a call. So Seth, why don't I pull you up really quick and tell us a little bit more about Viva MedTech so folks can be familiar with it. You're going to be guiding this discussion today. So tell me, I know all about Viva MedTech, and I'm sure many of our panelists and participants do, but tell me from your perspective, where do you think, how do you think Viva fits into this great program today and in our incredible industry?
Thanks, Brian, for the chance to do that and being some filler while we wait for Dr. Shuren to come up here off the cuff. I've been bringing products to market for 20 years now, right from the bench at the FDA as a consultant, and towards the tail end of my career, in the consulting space prior to joining Viva, really having good organization across traditional silos, quality, regulatory, clinical, which I think we'll be talking a lot about today, right? How do we have access to the data and documents that we need to interact with regulators, right? To share with global teams is really the business challenges that Viva is trying to solve with the industry cloud, with the life science cloud that we're building. So those are the key part of that, right? I see some of my, some customers here on some of the panelists that are leveraging our tools today to solve some of those challenges across that life cycle. So it's a privilege to be here today and happy to support this discussion as a sponsor and to facilitate the questions with Dr. Sharon.
Excellent. And I know, ladies and gentlemen, we're just having a little technical difficulty with Dr. Sharon joining, but he'll be on in 2 seconds. If we have some questions for Dr. Sharon, make sure you put those in the Q&A, although Seth's going to be guiding us through a conversation with him, and he'll be doing some prepared remarks. So as we work on this, let's go over, and Rachel's going to be working on that with Dr. Sharon. I'm going to go over just a sketch of the day for you guys. So we'll have our conversation with Dr. Sharon until about 1:15. Then we'll move into a panel discussion on FDA submissions in 2021 and how that's going. Then we're going to have a discussion at 2 o'clock, FDA evidence and product liabilities. And then we'll have, that's a hot topic session. So that's about 15 minutes. And then we'll have a panel discussion at 2:15, which will be what device approval looks like for an emerging company today. And we'll have some folks from Active Surgical and Corvia Medical with Covington and Berlin hosting that program. Then we'll have a congressional update with ML Strategies. We're excited about that. And then we'll have our closing keynote, FDA Medical Device Remote Regulatory Assessment. And that'll be presented by Trang Cox. She's the Supervisory Consumer Safety Officer at the FDA. Rachel, how are we looking over there?
I've just communicated with them the new link, so give us just 1 more minute, and hopefully that will work. I do apologize. There's always a little snafu sometimes with Zoom, so just give us 1 more minute. Let me see if we can get him on board.
Great. So I wonder if we could launch one of those poll questions right now while we have this time.
That sounds great. And I actually see him just jumping on. So let's give him 1 more minute and let's do a really quick poll, and then we should be good to go. So that's a great idea. I'm going to go ahead and launch the first poll that we'd really love your feedback on. And it's around back to office planning. So please feel free to fill this out very quickly. We'll just take a minute while Dr. Sharon gets situated, and then we'll get going. So here it is. Should see it pop up on your screen.
Great. And while everybody's filling that out, I'm going to go ahead and make our introductions here. So we are very, very pleased to have Dr. Jeff Sharon here. He's the director for the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH. Dr. Sharon has been a face of consistency at the agency. He has always been somebody that our industry can rely on in terms of getting the straight answer. He's always answering all of our industry's questions, and we're really thrilled to have him here today. As I said, Dr. Sharon will be doing some prepared remarks, and then Seth will lead him in a discussion. Dr. Sharon, how are you doing? Can you hear me?
Oh, good. How are you?
I'm excellent, thank you. So as we're going to hand it over to you when you're ready. I see you got your slideshow up. I can see that. And we're ready for you whenever you are.
Fantastic. And everyone can see the slides?
Yes, we can, sir.
All right. Then I will go ahead and kick it off. Well, appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone today. And I'm just going to talk for a few minutes. I thought I'd focus on what's going on with COVID at CDRH, and then plenty of time for questions and answers. And so let me just make sure. There we go. Our role in COVID has really been around 2 activities. It's been to facilitate the availability and access to medical devices, and also to mitigate supply chain shortages. And I'm not going to talk about the second one very much, really focus on the first. And our ability to facilitate that availability and access to medical devices comes from 2 actions in particular. When the public health emergency was declared, we were able to make use of our emergency use authorization authorities gave us tremendously more regulatory flexibility to tailor the approach to the technologies. And then combined with very extensive engagement with developers, it's really the approach that we took. And as a result, for example, in the case of tests, it allowed for tests to be developed, validated, authorized, and deployed in literally weeks rather than more traditional months or a year or longer. And that said, what we dealt with at the center was essentially a tsunami of requests on emergency use authorization. So what I have on the slide right here, if you look in the blue, you'll see sort of the number of pre-market submissions. This isn't all of them, but it's really most that we receive in a given year. And you can see what happened in 2020, actually more than we typically do. But now on top of it, we received almost 5,700 emergency use authorization requests and what we call pre-EUAs. This is the opportunity to work directly with our experts, get questions answered, and provide data on a rolling basis. So about a 38% increase in the submissions we were receiving, and that's continued in 2021. And what this translated into is the following, that we wound up authorizing around 1,300 medical devices so far, some through our EUA authorities, some through traditional pathways, mostly 510K, but even a few de novos through a variety of different kinds of products. And here's the story with tests through March of this year. And as you can see, authorizing over 350, and now it's over 360 tests to the marketplace. In fact, in 2020, we were authorizing on average one test every single day. And there are tests now, a variety of different kinds of tests for different kinds of uses in different kinds of settings, from the labs, point of care, to at home. Lots of options, lots of flexibility. And then for other kinds of products, a massive increase in the variety of personal protective equipment that's available in the US marketplace, as well as ventilators, respiratory assist devices, and a number of other technologies. Now, on the engagement side, we provided those opportunities a number of ways. So I mentioned the pre-EUAs. We also made available a number of email boxes to post questions. And in fact, for several months, we had a 24/7 1-800 hotline that anyone could call to ask any question. And we'd either answer it right then or we connected to the experts to provide feedback. And you can see the number of inquiries through the end of March, almost 400,000. Since the beginning of March of 2020, we've held a weekly webinar for test developers to give them updates and to answer their questions. And we've held webinars on a variety of other topic areas as well. Right now, we're going to hold our 70th tomorrow. We make our recommendations regarding the validation of different technologies, particularly tests, available in what we call an emergency use authorization template. And that also allows a developer to provide their data in sort of a fill out form to make it easier to get that information to us. And we've continued to adjust that and adapt it over time as circumstances change over on the ground. And we, in fact, put out 13 of them. When we get common questions, we put out answers on our website. We now have 325 frequently asked questions, and those too will be updated as new information becomes available. If there's safety information that needs to come out, we've issued safety communications, already 22. And we've been working with NIH on their RADx program from the very beginning. And this is about facilitating the development and availability of tests predominantly for point of care and at home. We also provided more flexibility and engagement through the availability of guidance documents, now 28. Flexibility in allowing for cleared and off-approved devices to be modified in particular ways, such as to incorporate the ability to provide care remotely without the need for review by the FDA, as well as things tailored to shortages, and I'll talk about in a minute, viral variants. As we well know, the SARS-CoV-2 virus has been mutating over time. And we've been monitoring this actively since March of last year. And when we identify that there is a mutation that either by itself or in combination with other mutations might adversely impact the performance of a test, we'll reach out to the developer and work with them to better assess and understand if there's an impact, and if there is, communicate that to the public. We issued a safety communication on this several weeks ago, and now we provide updates on our website. We also issued guidance back in January for developers on the things that they can do to both assess whether or not their test has been impacted by one or more mutations, as well as to design their tests in ways that they are less likely to be impacted by current and future viral mutations. Now, I mentioned all the incoming we've seen with COVID-19, and unfortunately, that's had an adverse impact on the work that we do. For starters, even on the COVID work. What I've shown here on the slide is what's happened over time in the review for EUAs for tests and for other kinds of medical devices. And early on, when we had a few number of submissions, if the EUA was complete, looked good, we were authorizing, in the case of tests, within a day. Some of the tests, EUAs, we authorized in less than 24 hours, within a single day. But as the volume increased, and we also got more pre-EUAs, working now with over 1,000 developers for tests alone, that review times have simply taken more and more time. And we've tried to address that with streamlining our own processes, triaging submissions, putting in prioritizations, and reassigning people to the COVID work. And with some additional dollars we got from Congress, bringing on board at least temporary people to help out. But in spite of it, still a massive increase of work. And that has had ripple effects on our other performance. So for example, we have been meeting our MDUFA 4 performance goals. However, we're now starting to see an adverse impact on review that probably isn't going to show up in our performance goal metrics for at least several more months. But you can see here for 510Ks, really the first time in years that we're seeing performance go in the wrong direction. And this is what's happening with PMAs, also starting to trend in the wrong direction in spite of years of improvement. There's also been an adverse impact on our work on policy documents. Now, obviously, we put a lot out on COVID, but as a result, we've not had the ability to put the time and attention as much into other high priority policy efforts. For example, issuing our regulation on the ISO 13485 standard is a top priority for the center, but that has taken a little bit of a back seat as a result of COVID. I will tell you that is back on track, and we are looking to put that rule out this year. Obviously, it goes through a level of review in the administration, so I can't tell you when that will happen or if there are different perspectives we need to incorporate from the administration, but it is a top priority, and we are now moving ahead on that full blast. We also will be putting out additional guidances related to COVID. There'll be one on medical device shortages, but also one on transition. You know, what are the expectations if you have a product on the US marketplace under an EUA? What happens when the trigger gets pulled? Certainly the emergency ends or something else occurs. What then are the expectations and timeframes for if you wish to keep your technology on the marketplace? When and what do you need to do? Certainly encourage those developers who have a product on the marketplace under an EUA, don't wait for the end of the emergency. If you're looking to keep it on the marketplace, gather the additional data and come in the door for a full marketing authorization. And if you have questions about that, please ask, but don't wait for the last minute. Another impact has been on our inspections. And of course, with COVID rampant in the US and in other countries, we had to also take into account the safety of our inspectors. We could not be sending them out to hotspots, and certainly before a vaccine became available. That's just putting their lives at risk too. Not only that, but then they're going to facilities and maybe if they're infected, putting others at risk. And so we were not able to do a lot of the on-premises inspections, but we did look for other opportunities to get the information we needed in lieu of doing that on-site inspection. So in a number of cases for pre-market approvals where we typically would do an inspection, we looked for other sources of information. We were able to leverage audits conducted under the Medical Device Single Audit Program. Sometimes we were able to receive separately performed ISO 13485 audits and be able to leverage that data. Certainly our past experiences with a manufacturer, and in particular if it involved the same product, a production line or similar product, then we would forego an inspection and that product would move forward. So very few devices have been delayed at all in their review because of not being able to have inspectors on site. I will say too that you've seen what our Center for Drugs has put out regarding the guidance and the use and the ability to do remote regulatory assessments. The medical device program in our Office of Regulatory Affairs, so OMDRO, has been doing that as well. And certainly since February of this year, approximately 50 of these remote assessments. And they will continue to test drive what they're doing now. They're essentially using established platforms, like WebEx, to have a virtual interaction with folks at the medical device facility. And right now, it's gaining more experience with those approaches as new tools become available, trying those out, and then developing what are best practices. And certainly encourage for any manufacturers who are engaging with that either now or in the future. One, make sure you've got and know how to use whatever virtual platform is being used. Our folks also give out sort of a handout before that assessment occurs with some additional pointers. But we're very much interested in your feedback on what's working well and what could work better. And that will help inform us in changes we make in the future and what may get incorporated into best practices. Now, I mentioned the impact of COVID on our COVID work and also on our non-COVID submissions and increase in review times. Well, unfortunately, because of the high volume, it has impacted a lot of submissions in the center, particularly in those parts that have had a high COVID workload. The biggest hit area has been in vitro diagnostics. And in fact, some pre-market submissions we have had to put on hold, as well as Q-subs. Last week, Bill Mazel and I put out a Voices piece to sort of lay out what we've done to address that growing workload and the delays and what we are doing now. And we are moving forward. So all of the pre-market submissions that have been on hold, we are in the next few weeks going to be moving forward on all of them. However, particularly in the case of IVDs, they are going to take longer than otherwise inspected and anticipate that we may be missing MDUFA goals. For other product areas, we're going to try to meet those timeframes, but on a case-by-case basis, in other areas that have been hit, like in personal protective equipment, there may be delays. And for Q-subs in the IVD space, we think it's important that we devote our resources to pre-market submissions, which means we don't have the resources to spend time on Q-subs, with the exceptions of if it pertains to COVID, breakthrough devices, or companion diagnostics. And in the other product areas, again, there may be some delays. We're going to hold those Q-subs, but it may take additional time out to 120 days. But our goal is to try to get back to normal as soon as possible. And then finally, I wanted to leave you with some lessons learned out of COVID, two in particular. I mentioned early on what we were able to do that was unique in COVID. One was this regulatory flexibility with the EUAs, and a second was this extensive engagement. Those were truly influential in being able to have this 1,300 approximately devices authorized for use for COVID during this time period, and would not have occurred otherwise. And as we look to the future, we really should be thinking about how we can have these capabilities and abilities available, not just during the time of a public health emergency, but quite frankly, during peacetime. And this is something that's informing discussions around MDUFA 5. So I'm going to stop here and go ahead and take questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shuren. It's good to speak with you today.
Same here, and it's Jeff.
Okay, Jeff. I appreciate that. I'll do my best. So first of all, the agency has really just done a tremendous job with all the EUAs, continuing to review the new products to the market, right, and meeting those congressionally mandated review times in this time of a lot of stress. Can you just talk a little bit more about just how the teams are doing, and if you're seeing any trends on when things might get back to normal, or if it's too early to say?
Well, first I'd like to say just how proud I am of my colleagues at CDRH and across the agency. Look, COVID, we all know it's been a tragedy, not just for the US, but for the whole world. It's disrupted pretty much everybody's life. And so no difference at the FDA. But I'm just so proud of our folks stepping up to the plate and really leaning forward, doing things that we've never done before because of the pandemic. But it's taken its toll too. I've mentioned the high workload that added on from COVID. Certainly people's personal lives have also been disrupted, not only working out of home, but the rest of their families, not disconnected from social networks, children who haven't been able to go to school, being able to take care of loved ones and friends, no different than other people in the country and elsewhere in the world. We've invested a lot in the wellness of our employees, even recently setting up a virtual wellness center, bringing on someone on board to also focus on wellness activities for our staff and ways we can find to truly try to find that right work-life, work-life balance. But when do we return to normal? I'm not sure what the new normal is going to look like for all of us. I anticipate we're going to see more people teleworking than before. We certainly have communicated out in the center that we are not expecting to kind of open the doors at White Oak for our folks till at least after September, with the exception of those people who have non-portable work, folks in our labs, and they've already been back in campus in rotating fashion to get their work done. But we're going to see, I think, changes in whatever this new normal will be. And that may also reflect in other activities. How we engage with industry will likely change as well. And I think COVID, the lessons learned, we should take the best out of COVID, the silver lining, and then adapt that for our work today.
No, I think that's great. And it's good to hear that, everyone's adapting to what that new normal is, and maybe, that silver lining, right? Do you have any indication of some of the early thinking about what some of those silver linings might be, or some of the best practices you have learned from this stressful time dealing with this high volume, right? I know still a lot more thinking to come, but what are some of if you have any examples of that silver lining that might get incorporated into the more general reviews or communication methodologies in the future?
Well, for starters, we're getting used to the virtual environment. And I'm hoping that technologies will also improve the experience of the virtual environment. And I do think the opportunities to gauge, do we always need to have large group of people descend on White Oak for conversations? Can we have something that's a bit more, fluid? The same goes for our inspections. And right now, these remote regulatory assessments, they're not true inspections per se, but do we get to that standpoint and leverage some of these other technologies? Others lessons learned are the two that I put up. There's regulatory flexibility and engagement. We all know that the medical device regulatory framework is over 40 years old. It was not designed for today's technologies, particularly when we get into digital health, software as a medical device. They literally was designed for my grandmother's technologies. And they've been, the law's been tweaked over time, but in a lot of cases, it's not fit for purpose. I'd say one of the things we learned is, I think the time has come, let's change the regulatory framework for devices in a way that better suits those technologies and still provide those reasonable assurances of safety and effectiveness. We can drive innovation and safety in parallel, but we got to change the framework. And until we do that, technologies like digital health, they are going to struggle here in the US. That's the reality of it. And COVID has taught us we got to change. Engagement is another piece of it. And I'd love to see that ability to do that level of engagement, particularly what we could do early in the pandemic, and even modify it in certain ways. Go beyond, our leaning in on issues to truly be just problem solve, not the we'll tell you if what you're going to do looks good or not. Let's actually engage, and rather than be stuck with a lot of formal Q subs, can we have an ongoing dialogue, if you will, with developers? That is a radically different way of engaging. That's a problem solving that would be starting earlier in development. We too often, and this occurs in Medufa, we focus on what facilitates review. The real answer is, if you deal with all the issues early on, first of all, the folks who should fail fast, you move on. And those who are moving along, let's move along faster by solving those issues along the way. And ultimately, we've got the answers, you got a good quality submission, a pre-market review is a coronation.
Got it. No, that's great. Thank you. And, at Viva, right, our goal is to build the industry cloud for life sciences, right, and provide those tools for industry to use across clinical, regulatory, quality. So we've been helping, it's been a crazy year for us as well, helping companies figure out how do I, audit my clinical trial sites virtually? How do I audit my supply chain remotely? And, I'd be curious, when you're talking about getting to that collaborative state, right? What do you think the biggest barriers are? Is it, the tools, the digital tools, the technology that FDA has at their disposal? Is it the regulatory framework that needs to be changed? Combination of all the above? How do we get, because I think the industry, wants that too, right? They want that collaborative discussion and ongoing collaboration.
Yeah, well, I mean, first off, to have that kind of discussion, more ongoing basis, we've got to be resourced to do it. So I am going to, so that is one. It's a challenge today. Developer may say, I'd love to have that ongoing dialogue, but guess what? We got other people in the queue.
Mm-hmm.
The line up at the phone booth where everyone's tapping on the glass, your 5 minutes are up because I'm next in line. That's what we deal with. What you really would like is, no, I don't have to sit there waiting on the phone booth. I've got my private line and I have the conversation. But that means we got to have more phones, if you will, on operating. So that's one level. Two is, there are the opportunities with technology to help and to change the experience. And that's beyond just simply the conversation that we can have right now, let's say. It's also how we engage around information and data. We're very much tied into put a submission together, send it over the wall. We need to have the systems to be able to deal with this differently. And we're already doing that in something we call digital transformation. I'm happy to go into that as well as to what's come out now and what you can anticipate, in the near future. And then it's rethinking about even, do we deal with this stage gate approach on how information comes in the door? Or do we go to a much more fluid interaction, not just this human interaction between us, but this data flow that goes between a developer and the FDA, and even looking at things that may not be product specific, they're developer specific. That's something we've been piloting in the digital health space around pre-certification. But for those to happen, we also need to have a different regulatory paradigm. So we got to have the people, we got to have the tools, and we got to have the regulatory framework if we're going to make this work.
No, that's great. And that's great to hear that vision, right? Because the interaction today is very document centric, right? Whether you're sending that over as a PDF, even if you're putting it on in emailing, you're not printing anymore, which everyone's happy about, but it's still a document centric approach versus data and that data flow and data exchange. Yeah, if you don't mind, it'd be great to hear a little bit more on your thoughts around that digital transformation, right? How you're taking those best practices from the pre-certification for digital health, right? That collaborative review. And to look at data, we're privileged to be active on MDIC, and just another case, when you have the case for quality, a lot of that is how do we look at data ongoing? We're looking for trends, continuous improvement in quality all through data. So I feel like we're seeing bits and pieces of this transformation occurring, right? But it's pulling it all together. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that digital transformation and where we are in that journey today.
Sure. Yeah, so digital transformation, well, I'll tell you where we started from. We had a lot of these legacy siloed systems. I mean, it was a spaghetti chart. If you put it up on the wall, I think we had 31 different systems. And we needed to move towards agile platform and, data in the cloud, certain challenges at FDA over cybersecurity to make that happen, but have worked that through and having the dollars. And we tried to squirrel away some money. Congress has also given us some additional dollars. So we have mapped this out. We're already implementing. What do things look like for now? So there'll be, for starters, two big platforms we deal with. One is for the outside world, for you all, our customer collaboration platform. And we just did a soft launch of an early version. And one of the early capabilities is a FedEx tracker, where you can, see where your 510K, or at least certain 510Ks are in the review. And we've had about 70, 80 or so companies do that, and the feedback's been very, very positive. So, we're certainly going to grow that. That's just an example, but where we want to be is we have a virtual workspace for us, that this isn't just throw it over the wall, that we can start to engage. And we'd love to get to the point where we can engage around even data in real time, put things up there and have data flow in on a more routine basis. But that means we've got the systems to grab them in, to aggregate, to apply advanced analytics on, and the people to kind of do those assessments. And the idea is if you can do that, you may allow for a lot of things to occur out on the marketplace without doing the formal submission to the FDA, because we're sort of monitoring on it. Think about it. It's like being at the control center for a transit system. We're watching all the trains. We can see where they are. We can see what's going on. If it's a green light, you can keep going. If it's, there are some issues, a yellow light, you may have to slow down. If it's a red light, put on the brakes. Let's deal with this. And we go from there. So digital transformation, that's one of it. On the inside for us is a decision management portal. We're going to move away from, for example, our reviewers. They may have 10 different systems open up at the same time, move it down to one, have that very fluid data integrated and tools that really help them in their reviews.
Okay. No, that's great. So just to make sure I understand, right? So there's the components of one, the collaboration with the reviewers is one component, right? Because on the industry side, you have the funnel of all their experts, biocompatibility testing, their clinical experts, they kind of funnel that through their regulatory department. Then that goes into that lead reviewer who then kind of splits that back out, right? So part of that is, if I understand, like getting that collaboration across the experts in a more seamless data-centric way. Is an interesting possibility. And then just so I understand, when you're thinking about the data that you're looking at and coming in, are you thinking about quality data? Are you thinking about real world evidence, right? And having, more ongoing monitoring. Just curious about what data sources you're thinking about wanting from industry.
So we're interested in all of those. The issue becomes how good is the data, right? Mm-hmm. On the one hand, we don't want just data dumps and everything coming in the door. We want to start with the capability to be able to leverage that data, but at the same time, we have efforts devoted to data quality. So for starters, on real world data, a lot of things out there, they're poor quality, and as a result, they're not worth the squeeze as much. And so you've got to deal with both. You have to deal with the data issues, and you have to deal with then what I'll call data use issues, our capability to make good use of that data. And the digital transformation is on that second piece. We have other efforts that are devoted to the first piece on data quality.
Okay, excellent. No, thank you. Just a reminder for everyone, on all the participants, they can put their questions in, and I'll do my best to facilitate those to Jeff. Maybe let's talk. I know the last session is going to go in detail on the remote regulatory assessment, which is great to see, right? Voluntary, today. We've seen some guidances from CDER just last week around the remote interactions for drugs and BIMO audits. Just curious at a high level, how you see that potentially evolving, right? And are there any regulatory, legal restrictions that you have, right, on going remote, right, versus the in-person audits, and kind of just talk through how you see that going, and again, some of the barriers that a full, virtual audit from the FDA's perspective, what's holding getting to that state?
Yeah. Well, as you noted, first of all, it is voluntary. And if we're really going to, use this as a more routine method, probably moving towards changing the law so it's not voluntary. And we've got a little bit more strength behind it. I think the second is a bit more experience with this remote sort of assessment. And like I said, right now it's more a platform-based interaction. So it's much like right now we're talking to one another. So I could say, great, we're doing our assessment. Here are the documents I need. Why don't you ship them over? We're going to have to work on how do we get a better look in the facility? Remember, if we're not there, how do we walk around the facility to see things? The document side, yeah, you could send things. So that we still got to work out. Is it, we're not at a place where it's a true replacement, right? Replacement for that, but in some circumstances where it's going to be more dependent on a document review, it might for a piece of it, to supplement or to come back if there are follow-up questions without having to come, in the door. And we have to think creatively at this point. We're also over time going to see other tools being used, and we'll get experience with that. That will expand what we're able to do. But along the way, we're going to welcome your feedback, not only on what we're doing and what could be done better, but you have other ideas of how we could turn this into a truly remote inspection.
That's great. Yes, putting my former FDA days, right, being on site, right, seeing the facilities, right, are a big part of that process, but then is there, right, as you're saying, something in between where the experts in that field can review the documents, right, but not necessarily on site, is good. So this is the U.S. approach, right? And obviously everyone looks to the U.S., right, looks to the FDA as best practices. Where do you see this going? Or are there any discussions with other health authorities around how to help each other out during this time? I think you talked a little bit about information sharing, from notified bodies or MDSAT audits. Just curious on any harmonization around this modernization, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's an important question. There's been nothing yet. Most of the harmonization efforts for us are in the context of the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And that, of course, is where MDSAP is housed. MDSAP, as mentioned, has been very helpful during the pandemic. Now kind of goes to, well, what about these remote assessments? I think it's too early. At this stage, we've got to figure out for ourselves what can work or not work. Before we think about what we might do on an international level. Can MDSAP go remote? for example. And those are things, again, we'll need to work out. I mean, who knows? We might have the FDA drones. You know, you may get a knock on your door and it's not a person, it's a drone. And, you know, we can just fly through the facility. Take a look what's happening.
That's it's
interesting to
think about. Yeah, that's great. You know, and I think you mentioned a little bit, but just to clarify, you know, so what can industry do to really be prepared and help the FDA, right? We've heard you say, like, give us feedback, tell us what's worked, right? Make sure we have the right tools. But what else can industry do to support the FDA during this time?
Well, certainly, you know, on these assessments, it's also, you know, like anything else with a true inspection, just be well prepared on the data production, you know, get us the things we need as, you know, as quickly as possible really does make a difference. And I just think during these challenging times with a lot of the extra workload, one is patience, and a lot of people have been patient, and we empathize. We know this has had an adverse impact on, you know, people across the board. You know, certainly with industry, and if they've got products in the door with us, patience, because it also means, you know, delays in other products coming to the marketplace. We're deeply concerned about the adverse impact on the treatment and diagnosis of other medical conditions, you know, that in some respects take a bit of a, you know, of a back seat as a result. So all around empathy, I think helping, you know, with us beyond the understanding is, you know, the better job you do on what you get to us and, you know, the quality of what you do and what you submit really makes a difference in our workload. I cannot tell you, when people do a great job on their evidence gathering and how they put together their submissions, it is a world of difference in terms of the amount of time and effort we have to spend than, you know, that review. And a lot less time we have to deal with the developer on, you know, here are the issues, problems, and following up on them.
Okay, no, got it. That's great. And then, you know, thinking about the, you know, the legal framework or the legal, I don't want to say constraints, but the legal box in which the FDA operates in, right? What are some of the things that, again, we can do as citizens, right, as industry, but also citizens to help free up to create some of that flexibility, right? Are there any things from a governance perspective that, or legislation perspective that we should be looking at in the near term, or do you feel like this might be conversations, you know, that pick up post-COVID, right? Once you get unburied from the EUAs.
Yeah, well, there will certainly be legislation. We anticipate there'll be legislation around COVID, certainly. But we know that next year, you know, the User Fee Act, MDUFA, is back up for reauthorization. Typically around those times, Congress may look at complementary legislation that can go on. There's been, of course, scuttlebutt about will there be a 21st Century Cures 2.0. So there are likely to be vehicles in the next year or two in which, if changes are going to be made, there would be an opportunity to do that. I think the time has come, and, you know, I'm not shy about it. It's not new. I've talked about how the regulatory framework needs to change. It should be agile to allow us to deal particularly with emerging technologies. And there are ways to craft this that are for the benefit of patients, and I think will serve industry well too. You can instead think about a model in which here are the various kinds of building blocks you can use to design the pathway to market, and here are the constraints, right? It's got to be, you know, here's the regulatory standard, reasonable assurance, safety, and effectiveness. It's got to be least burdensome. Could even design it. It can't be more burdensome than the traditional pathway available. And maybe even considering them as voluntary alternatives, something we've done with the safety and performance-based pathway that we have now with 510K. So there's lots of ways to do it that folks should feel, okay, we'll avoid the unintended consequences, but we get the real benefit as it. Now I talk about these as regulatory Legos. Put them together for as you need to build what you need to build. But I think the time has come, to do it, but it is going to take a concerted effort to make it happen. I just worry that in the absence of these changes, we're just going to see some of the most important technology held up, and our hands will be tied because the law is the law and we got to follow it. And some of the edge turning we've seen of really innovative products coming to the US, we'll start seeing that shift, back to other shores. And we know there are other countries that are strongly looking at taking that over, with China being probably top on the list.
Yeah, that's a great point. Maybe this is a good time to transition, from the digital transformation discussion, right, into some of the other regulatory Legos you were talking about. And I do agree. I'm on the AI subcommittee on MDIC with the clinical group around, right, what does AI look like, right? Bringing that discussion is one of those areas, right? How do we regulate that appropriately with something that's always changing is a question that is out there. So, maybe we can talk a little bit about the safety and performance-based pathway that you just brought up, right? I think there's been 6 guidance documents out so far, right? Over the past, I think August is the first one. Are there any initial learnings from that pathway? Because I think that criteria is a good one, right? It's talking about creative, least burdensome approaches, being very clear on what is expected and the criteria to pass. I'm curious if you have anything to share from the first year of this program.
Well, still too early to tell. It's just too soon. That said, we do have one full submission under that pathway in the door. And some other developers have been leveraging safety and performance to meet some of the criteria and then meet the rest by doing the comparison with the predicate. So a little bit of a hybrid approach. We've seen some companies trying to take, which we're interested in as well. So we've got some early takers in whole or in part, and we're going to learn from that experience. I strongly encourage, if you're making product that falls within one of those product types, and you're going to come in with a 510K, think about test driving the safety and performance-based pathway, and then we'll continue to put out guidances for other product areas. Obviously, COVID has made it a little bit more challenging to do so.
Got it. Great. I mean, so another pathway, right, that I think encourages that collaborative review, right, is the breakthrough device program, right? I think a year ago about now, right, I think that you had 300 designations, that made it through a year ago. How is that program going, right? Any updates on the breakthrough device pathway in terms of approvals, right? I know or leverage of that, in combination. I mean, the EUAs were separate. Maybe others might look for moving some of the EUA technology and how to bring that to market, after the pandemic, might leverage that. But again, just curious, any updates on the breakthrough device pathway and how that's continuing to evolve?
Gangbusters. Continues to be, high enthusiasm for the program. We're now at, I think as of 2 weeks ago, it was like 460 designations. Yeah, really unbelievable. First few years, it was like a doubling every year. Mm-hmm. Now there are just so many that it's hard to, double, but it continues to increase. In terms of marketing authorizations, there have been 26 devices. And a blend of PMAs, de novos, and 510Ks. So it's really been everything. We'll see more. A lot of folks get that designation early in development, so it's still going to be a few years out before we get there. Now, one of the things we offer in breakthrough devices is that more extensive engagement, but we've seen too limits in what we're able to do. That has been a resource issue and a holdback in breakthrough. So what I mentioned earlier about this more extensive, and I think is going to be a somewhat different way of engaging. If you take that and apply it to breakthrough, for starters, then we're really talking about, trying to markedly reduce that time from concept, to pre-market submission, and certainly will be, ultimately for, marketing authorization. But we're very interested in shortening that time for when you come in the door with the submission, because like I said, you deal with that right, it's a coronation from there on after.
Right. No, that's great. And I know there was some early progress with breakthrough in CMS, and then looking at breakthrough program, which is taken a step back. Have you seen any impact on the CMS stance, right, on the device, on the breakthrough program, right, and sponsors' interest or changes? But it sounds like not, if you're getting close to 500 now.
Well, the big question right now is what's going to happen with MSIP. There's been the 60-day delay, and they're going to have to decide what they do with that regulation. Does it go into effect? Does it get changed? Does it not go into effect? We'll have to wait and see. Obviously, big incentive. If that goes into effect, really a tremendous driver, I think, for innovation here in the U.S., and that will certainly, we think, further expand the interest in the Breakthrough Device Program in a incredibly good way, because we're not putting anything on the market that's not safe and effective. But we'll see ultimately what gets decided.
Okay, that's great. As the Breakthrough Device Program is continuing, right, more and more reviewers on the review teams, right, are getting the chance to be involved, right? Is that something that all reviewers now are active and a part of, or is there general best practice as it's almost 500 of them now, or are there still specific groups that are dealing with those?
It's still specific groups because it's going to go to the experts in that area, and there are more focused product areas that have been touched by COVID. Lots of areas have been touched a little bit, but not enough where people would get tons of experience with in the UA.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Talking about some other programs, I think you touched on it briefly, but maybe you can provide an update on the quality system regulation, right, and harmonization with ISO 13485, and how that's progressing.
Again, kind of backburnered a little bit with COVID, but it is back on track, and we are pushing forward hard on it. Our goal is, have it out this year, sooner rather than later, but that won't be up to us. There's just a lot of other eyes that go on it before it ultimately goes out the door. Got it.
Thank you on that. Prior to the pandemic kicking off, right, there were some discussions just about the 510K process in general, right, and the requirements there, and would changes, what changes would be needed to meet all the goals that you just laid out, right, to accelerate products to market, still ensure safety and effectiveness. Do you see any of that resurfacing in the near term, and or any other changes on that pathway?
Look, I mean, we continue to explore opportunities for enhancement in our programs, including for 510K. We've made a number of them over the past several years, through policies like foundational guidance on 510K, the 510K modifications, and other changes in the program that I think have been a positive all around. We get more science today, but up until COVID, also our reviews were going faster. And I think we continue to see better product coming out on the marketplace, but at the same time, we're always looking for opportunities, for enhancing our programs.
Great, thank you. And maybe we can talk a little bit now about, we talked a lot about the tools, right, and the resourcing. I heard those things a lot, which also then brings up MEDUFA discussions, right? Curious to share, if you have any top line items there that industry should be aware of or thinking around, MEDUFA and the needs to, right, from a review staff perspective or technology staff perspective and investments, right, to bring those improvements, to reality.
Yeah, so I've actually, this is kind of like the movies where you're watching scenes in the beginning, okay, that's great, that's great. In reality, it's foreshadowing, right? And then at the end of the movie, you go, oh, wow, now I connect the dots. So I happen to be talking a lot about engagement. And can we sort of take what we saw out of COVID, things we've learned out of breakthrough devices, and really change the paradigm on interacting with CDRH, and move from, formal discussion or even the one-off informal discussion to what's more of a true dialogue and a focus away from let's go find the problems with let's solve the problems. Mm-hmm. That is something that we're putting on the table for MEDUFA 5 and have raised. So folks are going to be hearing, more about that over time. And I think the time is right. And it's an exciting opportunity if we go there, because that, as we already know, is a huge driver in getting safe and effective technologies efficiently to the marketplace, but also where folks are going to fail, help them in reality fail sooner. And there's another piece to this too. For small companies looking to be acquired and the big companies looking to acquire them, having everything in shape, if you will, before doing it, you're more attractive as a target, if you will. Companies have less issues to deal with it because we deal with it on the back end. And all of this is kind of baked into what we're putting on the table for MedUFA 5. So trying to put a little bit of a teaser out there.
All right.
You'll see part 2 of the movie.
Duly noted. I knew that was a interesting topic, but no, but I think the M&A landscape, right, of medtech just continues to change, right? I think it's accelerating now, right, on the other side of COVID, right, all the cash that a lot of the larger companies have had, and how to incorporate those, right, into their organizations, right, from a quality perspective, regulatory perspective, is a challenge. But no, this was fantastic, Jeff. Thank you very much for your time. I know we might have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to pull Rachel back in from MassMEDIC here to help us close things out, but it was a great discussion and appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Seth. That was fantastic. And Dr. Sharon, that was wonderful. I think the one kind of remaining thing that's probably on everyone's mind, if you don't mind me pinging really quickly, is on, EUAs. And we're getting that from large companies. We're getting questions from small companies, right? How long do we think that is going to continue? And should, small companies really just be moving away from that pathway and really focusing on maybe the breakthrough designation? And any thoughts on that?
I think at this stage in the pandemic, the need for new technologies has changed. There isn't that same need, for example, around personal protective equipment as we saw before, but and particularly around things like decontamination systems. That's why we came out the other week to say, we're basically done authorizing those. There's not the need, and they were, really as a last resort. We're seeing that in the world of tests. The real priorities now are around point of care and at-home tests. I would say if you're in the test development world, that's where you put your time and attention. Certainly, for lab-based, if there's a huge increase in testing capacity, that also may be up there, but biggest focus is on, the access at home. Those are things to think about. If you're not sure, certainly ask. And we'd love to see folks coming in for full marketing authorization as well.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic. Really appreciate your thoughts on that. And like I said, Seth and Dr. Sharon, thank you both for a very informative discussion and just incredibly well done. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you. Take care, everyone.
So we have a few more minutes before we transition into our next session, and I hope you will indulge me with one more poll. So I'm going to go ahead and try to kick that off on screen. If you'll give me 1 second, we'd really love your feedback as we switch into our next presentation, and it'll give our panelists a second to get ready. Okay, so you should see that on screen. And we'll just take 1 minute for that. And while we do that, I'm going to queue up Lisa Casavant from RQM Plus. We will get started with your session in just a minute.
Could we also, I guess, queue up our panelists?
Absolutely.
give them a couple minutes in case they ran to grab a drink.
Exactly. No worries.
Judy. We just need Elijah and Kevin.
Great. And I see most of you filling out that poll. And while we're waiting, I will just make one more quick plug for the town hall that Brian mentioned. That is next week. We will be having actually a discussion on the impact of Brexit and EU MDR. So we're keeping within regulatory focused month. So please feel free to go to massmedic.com to check that out. We really would love your attendance on that. So Lisa, in the meantime, why don't we kick things off with just a little bit about RQM Plus while we wait for your other panels to get situated, and then we'll get started when we're ready.
Sure. RQM Plus is a regulatory and quality engineering firm serving medical devices and IVDs. We're excited to be here today and talk about FDA because it seems like all we talk about lately is EU MDR, and nothing has changed on the FDA side. We still are working hard on 510(k) submissions and such. So this is a great return to that today. We do a lot of panel discussions like this with our live show. We really like this format, because we can more easily share like best practices and things with industry. So that's what we hope to do today.
That's fantastic. And we actually do have one of your colleagues participating in our town hall next week as well, kind of giving us the inside scoop on Brexit from a medical device perspective.
Yeah,
so that's
Ed Ball,
fantastic.
he was a former regulator in Europe and is perfect for that.
Great. Okay, perfect. So I did just end that poll. It looks like Elijah is joining us. We're just waiting on, there's Kevin. Perfect. Awesome.
Give Elijah another minute.
Perfect. It's always a good time for a coffee break. Anytime you do a 4-hour video conference, it's always a good time for a coffee break. There we go. We'll just give it one more minute and then we should be good. Okay.
Is Elijah having some issues?
I believe so, yes. I'm just trying to work out those with him.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so I think he is definitely on. I think he's just having a little bit of a technical issue getting.
I'm on. I can see everyone.
Oh,
fantastic. Here we go. Great.
There we go. Now we see you.
All right, Lisa, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, great. We'll get started. So thanks for having us today. I'm Lisa Casabian, Executive VP at RQM Plus, and I'll be moderating our panel discussion today. We have a large panel, so I'll just go through them quickly. Judy O'Grady is Corporate VP of Global Regulatory Affairs at Integra Life Sciences. Amelia Gonzalez, Global Manager RAQA at MIM Software. Elijah Rhett. Elijah is Industry Representative for FDA Neurological Advisory Committee Device Panel and Regulatory Affairs Manager at Zimmer Biomet. Nancy Morrison, Executive Director of Regulatory and Quality at RQM Plus. And Kevin Go, Project Engineer at RQM Plus and former CDRH Lead Reviewer. So we will get started. So I think we're covering a lot of the same topics as Dr. Shuren did today, but we'll provide kind of the industry perspective on the same topics. So hopefully that will be helpful to everybody. So I guess let's start with, we all just listened to the excellent update from Dr. Shuren. Was there anything like new or surprising to any of you, hearing all of that from industry?
I think it was interesting, the collaboration and bringing that discussion up front. And I've definitely seen in breakthroughs products where that constant communication really, you do really develop a relationship with the reviewers, and that really helps the conversation go a little bit smoother. I think there's always a little bit of hesitancy, right? From a manufacturer, do I give information too soon and then I'm committed to it? Is this going to follow me through my entire submission? And I've seen that happen too. You go in with a question early in a pre-sub, and then that question haunts you 2 years later when you've got to do your final submission, and they remember that you were concerned about that early on.
I think the update from Dr. Shuren was really excellent, and FDA has been publishing, some new guidance documents, but also have really taken the lead and working with all the companies and to address COVID-19 through the number of EUAs. I think, and they just recently published some statistics on that. So it's actually quite impressive that during COVID, the number, I think, what he said, they had issued over 5,000 or 700 EUAs, but also the number of 510Ks, PMAs, Q subs, over 17,000. So that is really incredible. And they've had to divert a lot of their resources for the EUA, and rightfully so. And to his point, they've been holding regular webinars and updates and town hall meetings on, testing for COVID, tests for COVID-19. So I really think for all of us, while we've been getting regular updates, but the amount of work that's been done as far as, not only COVID-19, but also issuing some other pretty, exciting opportunities for medical device companies with some of the new guidance documents, such as the Safer Technology program.
Yeah, I would agree with Judy. I think Dr. Shuren's in-depth discussion of the MDUFA metrics was very, very eye-opening. Because if you look at the last quarterly MDUFA reports, or actually any of the MDUFA reports that have come out since the pandemic started, FDA has been hitting all their metrics. And it's been incredible given the fact what Dr. Shuren said, 38% increase in pre-market submissions, including EUAs, and they're still able to hit this metrics. But he kind of gave us a peek behind the curtain when he said, you're not going to see the impact of these delays until maybe 6 months down the line, right? So it'll be interesting to see what the new results look like, because we don't have that exposure just by looking at the public MDUFA results.
So Dr. Shuren provided an overview of what happened in 2020 due to COVID. It was a great update. Kevin, is there anything else you would want to highlight or speculate on the lasting impact to manufacturers, like what will be in 2021 on FDA resources and submission timelines and such?
Dr. Shuren's update was great. I think it solidified a lot of this information we were able to piece together from our end, right? Mm-hmm. In that white paper we released in, I think, June for RAPS Convergence, we talked about how OHT 1s, 4, and 7 were the really hardest hit. And he kind of confirmed this now with his update of no pre-subs unless it's for specific reasons related to COVID or breakthrough for OHT 7s, and delays in reviews for OHT 1s and 4. OHT 1s is, I think, respiratory, and OHT 4 is general surgery. OHT 7 is IVD. I think we just speak in acronyms all the time. Forget that, it's kind of new. But yeah, it was interesting this kind of hear him confirm everything that we've been feeling on the industry side. I think, like he's saying, we will start seeing more business return to usual for the divisions that are less affected. He mentioned that they had to divert resources in the beginning of the pandemic. And that's why I heard from my other friends who were not in OHTs 1, 4, or 7, that they did step up to help with EUA products. But now that it's dying down, the divisions that are not affected are starting to go back to business as usual, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I think I know in my company and many of the other companies, we experienced, with the delays, both sides. Number one, with Q subs, FDA was delaying, scheduling Q subs for like your general surgical devices. However, on the other hand, they were still keeping their commitments and regularly scheduling Q subs for your class 3 or, you know, some of your other breakthrough devices or other devices. So they were meeting those commitments, and then, you know, but then delays in some other areas, some less risk products, and of which, you know, there's many guidance documents out there to take advantage of.
Did we lose Elijah? Maybe. We'll see if he comes back.
Yeah.
There's Elijah. He came back. There you are, Elijah. We lost you for a minute.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll go on to our next question. So, you know, we've heard a lot about Q subs. Has anybody had any trouble with getting Q subs? You know, we're hearing blocks or delays. What's going on? Nancy, you're smiling. Have you had problems?
Yeah, we've had a few recent, and I think, right, it was pretty clear today from Dr. Shuren, if you have an IVD and it's not COVID and it's not a breakthrough, you're not going to get a pre-sub this year. That's just off the table. So that makes it really hard, right? Now you have to submit without it. We are seeing, even for some class 3 devices where FDA grants the pre-sub meeting, you get all the way up to 5 days before the meeting and they push out the meeting a week or two. So we've had that happen twice in the last week.
Oh, no.
Breakthrough devices, submission issue request, we are getting those on time and on target. So that's been nice from that perspective. The other we've seen outright delayed is things where there's really good guidance and a lot of products on the market. FDA has just said, no, we're not going to do that. Even if it's not in the IVD space, we've seen that as well.
We've also seen, and for some of the requests for Q subs, that again, are not general, you know, medical devices. However, FDA has come back and while granting the Q sub, has come back with really detailed responses addressing the questions to see if their, you know, response addresses your questions and they can cancel the Q, you know, do you still need the Q sub meeting? Because, you know, just even though everything's virtual, just the resource and the timing. So we actually, you know, I know a recent one had really, and we still had the Q sub meeting, we still want, but however, FDA had really spent a lot of time giving a detailed response, which was actually extremely helpful to our company.
Elijah, has your company had any trouble with Q subs?
No, we don't have any issue with Q sub so far. I think we plan to do one, I think in Q3 of this year. So I hope, you know, we don't run into any issue with the Q sub, but as of now, you know, I've not heard any trouble with Q sub.
How about you, Amelia?
So it's so interesting to hear the other perspectives because my controversial opinion under the Q sub umbrella, particularly is the pre-sub meeting. I generally don't include that as part of my regulatory strategy. I think with how interactive FDA has been and with the amount of guidance documents, like Judy mentioned earlier, I would prefer to kind of just put together the submission as well as we can, jump right in, and then use either a submission issue meeting or interactive review to kind of go through that with the reviewer rather than spending the time waiting for the pre-sub, which has worked out to my benefit during COVID.
Do you feel like with all software devices, it's easier to forego the Q sub, or actually there are more unknowns?
I think if it was quicker, I think in the software world, because we are so agile, I think the environment is different. I think if it was easier to be interactive in the pre-submission timeline, I think we would love to do that because, as Dr. Shuren mentioned, FDA recognizes that we need more people and resources and a new regulatory framework to address the digital health side. And there have been a lot of resources that have come out since 2016. However, there's still a lot of gaps there. And so we're definitely in this time period where we never really know what to expect from a submission. We don't really know what the reviewer is going to come back with. There's so many guidance documents still in draft. There's so many gaps. So it would be nice, especially if you're trying to work on an AI product, which I know also was addressed earlier. It would be really great to be able to have more open conversation, but I think it's just mainly the timeline and the resources on FDA side that makes us want to kind of shy away from that.
think it's a really interesting point. I think we've seen some of that with some of our smaller clients as well, right? So the point of the Q sub is to try to reduce the uncertainty or the risk with the submission and balancing that with like the timeline, right? Like, is it worth to try pushing back your marketing, pushing back your submission to address some of these risks? And I think with these now delays, companies, especially some of the smaller ones who are on tighter deadlines, are now evaluating what kind of questions are we trying to ask during this QSA space? Is it worth trying to submit this? Or is it better, like you're saying, just try to submit it and take your chances and try to address it with their submission issue or in the AI phase or something else, rather than waiting this now extended time period, if you even get feedback?
Mm-hmm. I mean, FDA came up with a new guidance document in January, actually setting kind of guidelines for the Q sub, but also, you know, in requesting them, you know, very often, you know, you could get a meeting within a month or, you know, a month and a half, but now they're saying a reasonable amount of time is 3 months. So to your point, Kevin, you know, in Amelia, you have to determine, you know, can you wait that amount of time for your timeline?
I think Lisa is Elijah. I think to Amelia's point, I think it depends on the device risk profile or the, you know, device classification. You know, my experience with pre-sub, you know, I've been pretty successful with pre-submission with the FDA, you know, and you know, like mobile application devices that I do, you know, in the past at Invancare Corporation, I think some of those questions and concern, like, you know, the level of concern in software testing and connectivity, you can address all those concerns in a pre-sub. And, you know, what we did at Invancare, we pre-submission, asked on the FDA, on the question in the pre-submission, and address all those questions in the pre-sub. And we use that our testing for the 510K. And all those questions that FDA was going to ask, you know, I can review all the ARR, those questions already addressed in the pre-submission. So it kind of reduce our time to market. So again, it depends on the product and you are dealing with. Thank you.
A great discussion on that. Okay, let's see, next question. What could the impact of MDUFA 5 negotiations be? Let's start with you, Kevin. What do you think?
Yeah, so Dr. Shuren touched on that a bit. He said it was like that foreshadowing for engagement, which I thought was really interesting. And when he mentioned it, I was like, that kind of makes sense. Because we're seeing that a lot with a lot of their new pilot programs that have come out. They have that submission tracker one that's under pilot. They have the 10-day call for 510Ks. They have the flag pilot for an AI deficiencies. So I wouldn't be surprised to see more of these tied to some harder like deadlines, right? Like for MDUFA 5, FDA is going to implement these kind of engagement programs, like turning these pilots into full-time policies, which I think would be better for industry. You know, maybe as reviewers, they might feel slightly different, but I think for industry, this would be very useful resources.
Yeah, I think some of these pilot programs, you know, as you stated, Kevin, are very innovative. I mean, I was really, you know, intrigued by the submission tracker, you know, pilot program that they have. And again, some of the other programs that FDA is initiating. Again, hopefully they will turn into and expand them and turn into permanent, you know, programs. But I think for industry, it will really help, you know, hopefully streamline, you know, the review and, you know, get to some of the important questions early on. And so also companies, you know, we all have bosses, and when you have a submission and they're asking you, well, when's, you know, it's 60 days. Have you heard anything from about the 510K? It's 90 days, you know, just having this type of ability and tracker is really, I think, very novel and will be very important.
Yeah, I think it'll be depending how they roll it out. Because I know this is something that we've been talking about even when I was still in FDA. And I think it's really matters how they implement it. And some of the concerns I think that was raised internally was there's plenty of times where, say you give it to like your biocomp to a consultant, they review it, and then it goes back to the lead reviewer and he goes, hey, I actually have a question now about it. And they go back and now all of a sudden it's open. But then the sponsor looks at it and says, oh, what happened? I thought we were done with the biocomp issues, right? So it'll be interesting to see how they roll it out, because this is something that's been in the works, it sounds like, or at least as long as I've been in the FDA, they've been talking about this. So it'll be interesting to see how they roll it out.
So still on the back to the topic of EUAs, from what Dr. Shuren said, EUAs are really still taking up FDA resources and that data he presented, and Judy, you were quoting, it's a huge spike in submissions. It was more than I realized. So just wondering, like, Kevin, what are you hearing from your FDA friends? And for the rest of you who are putting in submissions, are you actually hearing from reviewers like, oh, we're running late or we're running slow because we're also working on EUAs?
Right. Basically, yeah. Basically echoing what Dr. Shern said. In that Voices blog that he referenced, that was released last Thursday, he actually gave a scale of how many EUA products they received. And the number he quoted was that it was 10 times, the number of EUAs they received this year was 10 times more than all the other EUAs cumulative for all the other health emergencies, which is amazing. It's just incredible how FDA has been able to field all of this as still meeting their MDUFA deadlines. But from what we're hearing from some of our FDA reviewers and friends is that it really is siloed to those groups, right? And I think we've been getting some feedback that, hey, start considering what's going to happen afterwards, right? I guess no one has a set date of when these EUAs are going to be pulled, but like Dr. Sharon was saying, there's less focus, less need for some of these. He said there was going to be just focus more on point of care devices. So some of like the other types of EUAs are less priority. So we've seen slowdowns in review times for those and responses. Which is good for the review divisions that are not focused on those, because then, business as usual is great for the rest of us. But I think we are seeing a slowdown in EUA review times for non-critical products.
Yeah, and I would say, right, a very significant difference from the beginning when he talked about a one-day approval and, we would send in a pre-EUA and get a response and a reviewer assigned within hours. And now it seems like you can send in a full clinical protocol and wait months to get feedback. Do you have an adequate control? Is your protocol okay? So definitely, almost to the point where you wonder, if I have to wait 2 months, right, to get feedback on my protocol, should I just go the regular submission route? Should I do a 510K? Would that be faster?
Yeah, and from an internal perspective, I think in the beginning, it seemed like everyone had their hands on some type of something related to COVID. Even in the orthopedic division, some of the lower level COVID for like masks or something were being shunted off to other reviewers. But now it seems like unless you're in those divisions, you're primarily just going to be working on your own product areas, which is a good sign, I think, that we're on the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Should all of these companies with EUAs be working on 510Ks right now? Like already?
I think yes.
Yeah.
I think I'd be getting ready if I had it, right? Because we have seen some, some withdrawn where they issue a revocation letter, where technology changes or the standards have changed and the products haven't kept up, or you don't know, right, when the public health emergency will be declared over. Hopefully soon, but it doesn't seem like it's going away too fast, but you do want to be ready for that. And it'll take a while to put together that submission and get it in and reviewed.
Yeah, I would agree that they're, ultimately they're going to want, 510Ks, or if it's a class 3 PMA, to be submitted for some of these, higher risk products. So definitely companies, are collecting the data and preparing their submissions.
Have any of you done EUAs? Or, and if you have, how?
Yeah, I did one EUA, but before I talk about EUA, I'm not sure if I heard Dr. Sharon correctly during his presentation. I think he mentioned something around 1,300 new devices for COVID in 2020. And he also mentioned that there will be a law around COVID-19, so he did not provide more information on that law, what it entails. So I'm very interested in learning about what that new law would be around COVID-19 very soon, because, eventually EU is going to go away. And, we all keep asking ourselves, if EU goes away, what become of those devices? They'll go away as well. They'll have to, seek the 510K process to set a device in the US. With my experience with EUA, I wasn't successful because, after we did an EUA, the FDA came back with questions in round 1. And, eventually it went to round 6. They were still asking questions. And the question FDA was asking looked like a typical 510K question, asking for test report and test data to demonstrate safety and efficacy. And, based on that, and the time and the resources to do that, it was going to cost money. So we just decided to put the EUA on hold and forget about it. So I think it depends on the kind of product you are working on. Some might get an easy pathway, and sometimes it might be tough to get EUA approval.
And something I don't think that would be implausible as well, talking to some of my other RA colleagues, was that they noticed that the anthrax, and I think the other one was the declarations of health were still active for those. So something that we were throwing around too was that potentially FDA may keep it open and may not pull these declarations right away, but based on the need of devices that they need for the public health emergency, they may start revoking some of these enforcement discretion guidances or revising what they put in those enforcement discretion guidances. So even though the declaration is still active, the enforcement policies regarding those device-specific groups might also change. So thinking about the marketing application, especially with Dr. Shuren foreshadowing it, I would say a lot during his talk. Thinking about it during moving forward would not be a bad decision. And this kind of ties back to that question Lisa had about what's going to happen in 2021, right? If all of these now EUAs that were under enforcement discretion now are coming in as full submissions, right? And FDA already had more submissions than ever last year. What's going to happen to the total marketing submissions this year or the following year when all of these EUAs become full marketing applications?
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see the amount of time, that FDA allows for submitting, the 510K or PMA, because you're right, Elijah, it was 1,300 new related devices to COVID-19. I mean, that's a number published on FDA's website. And so you can just imagine that if 1,300, 510Ks are coming into FDA for review, additional strain on resources. But I think this will be, again, interesting to see what kind of time allotment is provided. Or to your point, Kevin, if some of these EUAs are just canceled.
Yeah. The other thing I think you have to be careful of, you might have gotten an EUA early on with one set of criteria, but the criteria for acceptance has changed throughout the year. As devices became more available, the public health emergency, right? It wasn't so urgent. He talked about the decontamination devices for masks. Well, no, there's now enough masks available. So that stuff has changed. And some of that we're not seeing updated in the templates or in the guidance. You really have to dig through those town hall meetings, and there's a little snippet in the transcript that tells you that it changed. We know the sample size you need for testing of masks has changed over the year, and that's never been updated in the guidance, but it was given in a town hall or alluded to in a town hall meeting. So you really have to do a lot of regulatory digging to make sure when you prep that submission, you've got the latest and greatest criteria.
And it'll be interesting to see what his transition plan guidance document is going to be. The one that he mentioned where he said, I guess his takeaway was don't wait. But it'll be interesting to see what they actually release in that transition plan guidance document.
So what else has been delayed because of COVID that, has you concerned? He was listing some things. I think there are some other things. How is it impacting you? But Amelia, is there anything that is impacting your company?
Yeah, so the example that from our end that we think about a lot is digital health. MIM Software is an entirely standalone software-oriented company. So for us, the impact of the digital health program has been exciting, but also has been challenging. Like I mentioned before, it's great to see all these guidance documents rolling out over the last 4 or 5 years as the digital health program has been coming out. It's been great to hear all the updates from the pre-cert pilot and to think through what could this new regulatory framework look like. And it's really given us some hope. I think over the last couple of years, though, as we've seen just how slow the rollout is and how many areas the rollout kind of touches, it's been a little bit disheartening. I think we don't really see that light at the end of the tunnel like we used to. So it is interesting, though, because in the FDA's 2020 digital health update, on the first page, it says, from experiencing COVID through 2020 and seeing how quickly we need to be able to iterate on the FDA side, how important emerging technologies are, it makes this even more important to us, which is great. But on the submission side, one of the biggest challenges from the gap is you know, if you're going through a software submission, if you have any kind of standalone software, but AI in particular, which is discussed a lot in the working model, it's challenging. You have different things like an algorithm change protocol, which you really don't have any guidance on what that entails. We're seeing FDA kind of use terms in these documents that really need more explanation. So it's a complete guessing game when you go into a review and you really don't know what to expect back. So that's been challenging.
Anything else?
So one of the things we've seen is sometimes even in the midst of a 510K, change in reviewers that I think probably was related to the workload and the shifting priorities at the agency. And so you kind of have to start back, right? You got through this first round of questions and now you've got a new reviewer and those questions sometimes resurface or in a different way, or they have a different perspective on it. So we've seen some challenges with the new staff or changing staff in the midst of product life cycle.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Yeah, to put it in perspective, I think I was looking at the MDUFA, the chart, to get an idea of how many new reviewers there actually are in the agency and how much turnover, because I hear this anecdotally from friends and everything, but I guess we don't really have a scale. But looking at the last MDUFA quarterly report, they reported on the CDRH training numbers, and they report on how many reviewers participate in the reviewer certification program, RCP. And the reviewer certification program is it's a program or like a certification program that all new reviewers have to take within 60 days. And in the last 3 months of the year, 106 new reviewers were enrolled in that program, which is insane if you think about it, because 106 is basically a whole division at FDA. And that was just in the last 3 months.
Wow.
So not surprising that to hear that from you, Nancy, with all the turnover and new staff and just growing pains with trying to train such a big staff remotely.
Yeah, to Nancy's point, you know, I had a lot of situations, you know, where I was working on the 510K and, you know, I had a new reviewer, you know, on the 510K, maybe the old reviewer left to come into industry. You know, my experience with that, Nancy and Kevin, you know, I tried to keep all my communication from that previous reviewer, and I just document that. And when a new reviewer comes on and try to raise more questions, I say, well, we agree on this action for the 510K submission. And I try to use that in my, you know, response to the new reviewer. And for me, it works pretty well. You know, they leverage the existing reviewer thinking on a 510K, you know, to get the submission through the FDA process. So good point, Nancy.
So Dr. Shuren talked about inspections. I thought it was interesting because he said, you know, they're leveraging MDSAP data or ISO 13485 inspection data. That sounds preferable to FDA coming in and inspecting. Is there any downside to this?
Well, my only comment on that, I was flabbergasted when he said they were leveraging 13485 audit, you know, for FDA, because the FDA is yet to recognize that, you know, standard. You know, they've been going for, and I think Kim Trotman, you know, is one of the old FDA employees who's trying to get that certified through the FDA process. So I was a little surprised when he said that he's using that standard for FDA audit leverage. So, you know, I was surprised.
Well, FDA has been using the MDSAP. I mean, FDA, the US FDA participates in the MDSAP program. So that's actually been for a couple of years. And what we've found, you know, at our company is FDA, you know, would, if they were going to schedule an inspection, they would first determine that if you participate in the MDSAP program. So we have already, pre-COVID, saw a dramatic decrease in FDA inspections, US and international, as long as your MDSAP audit was in, you know, within a certain amount of time of FDA planning to come in. And so, you know, I'm sure all of you participate in MDSAP, and that, you know, also realize that the MDSAP audit report is sent to FDA. So that, you know, they can choose if there's some significant issues. But I think already MDSAP has decreased. And then when COVID hit, it, you know, it really alleviated for FDA to do, you know, inspections unless for cause. I think the only area, not the only, again, the big area is for pre-approval for PMAs. So that's not part of the NBSAP program. So I think there's been a delay in pre-approval inspections, and usually those are required in our discussions, regarding some, PMAs, is that, FDA needs to be on site, and they haven't been able to be on site. So they're looking for some innovative ways. Now, Dr. Shuren stated that we're using MDSAP. We've seen them use MDSAP for other inspections, but not, for the routine, but not for PMAs. So I think that will remain to be seen. And again, if you use MDSAP, most of the notified bodies are, have embraced virtual audits. So they've done virtual audits with companies for not only MDSAP, but for their renewal, their ISO audits. So I think this is an area we may, might be one of those innovative, collaborative areas we see in the future.
So in addition to the MDSAP audit reports, the ISO 13485 certificates, he also mentioned looking at potentially other sources of data that they normally wouldn't ask for, as well as those regulatory remote assessments. Yeah. So on the first point, we did submit an HDE manufacturing site change supplement per the guidance. And we had the reviewer asked us a lot of questions about the contract site that we were adding for certain sub-processes that I don't think we would normally submit in like a normal site change supplement. And if you read the guidance, it's not outlined there. When I reviewed those, I never asked for them. And part of my thinking was maybe they were digging deeper into the contract site because they were waiving the inspection. And I know for sure that this site was outside of the years that FDA would generally, the window of years that FDA would generally want to inspect the site. So maybe that's another point that you might see from FDA, is that when you do submit these kind of things, FDA might be asking for more in-depth processes that they normally, like SOPs that you normally wouldn't have. And then the regulatory remote assessments, actually I was talking to Nancy about it last week, is really interesting because they're billing it as voluntary. So I think a lot of companies are confused about is this, and I'll turn it over to you in a little bit, Nancy, but it's good to hear that, Dr. Shuren shed some light that it's voluntary because it's not backed by the law. And hopefully, once they finish the 50 group pilot or get more data on it, maybe that's another progression of addressing this backlog of inspections during this time.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting, right? You get a letter that says, would you like us to come in? We have had some success in asking FDA for alternate dates, which I thought was a great compromise on their part. They're asking for this voluntary remote assessment, and we were able to get a delay in the start date in order to accommodate some other things the business had going on. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah. It is very funnily written because they say like, oh, it's going to have no impact. Like, don't worry if you say no, it's no impact. But, like when we see voluntary for FDA, it's like, how voluntary is it really?
But they reserve the right to issue a warning letter following it and take regulatory action. So it's all voluntary, right? Yeah. And it won't count as your inspection, but they could still take regulatory action coming out of it.
And as far as I know, I tried looking up, I don't think there's a guidance document regarding device remote inspections. There's a drug one related, but I don't think there's one related to devices. So I think when you brought it up, Nancy, I was kind of surprised. I'm like, oh, there's no news from FDA regarding these remote regulatory assessments yet.
Yeah, I think it's relatively new. We've kind of used the drug guidance as just a place, right, to think about the agency's thinking and how they're approaching it.
So we have a couple questions from the audience. We do encourage everybody that's on the line there. Feel free to send more questions for our folks here. Here's the first question. Can you discuss lessons learned and give advice regarding submitting a successful de novo? Who wants that one?
I think that's one where I probably have to disagree with Amelia, and a pre-sub is probably a good idea. Those tend to have
de novo. Yeah, well, I think
for
even
de novo, I
agree
think
with
that's
that one.
Yeah, I think that one I would go the pre-submission route. It's really, it's not an easy road. I know the review time says 150 days. My experience is that it typically takes a lot longer. the better your pre-sub, the better you outline what testing you're going to do, what you're going to submit. I think the easier path you'll have. The other thing we've seen is sometimes the indications for use get so watered down in the de novo path that, you know, you almost get to the end and wonder, why was that even authorized? Like, it doesn't seem to have much value. And you know, in the beginning, there was this whole much broader indication for use statement that got whittled away because the evidence to support everything, you know, was so expensive to collect or difficult to collect or had some confounding factors that, right, what you can agree to support with evidence, you know, narrows it. So I think it's a worthwhile path. I think it's gotten better. If you look at the timelines and the approvals, definitely the frequency and the timing form has gone down over time. But you know, it's not a cakewalk, and you need to take it.
I agree with Nancy that submitting a de novo classification, definitely agree with you totally, to have a pre-sub, a well-prepared pre-sub meeting with FDA with good documentation. It's not an easy road, agree too, and the timelines can be extended with multiple, you know, questions and requests from FDA, but definitely that would be one to have, again, a very detailed pre-sub meeting on.
So definitely agree. Oh, sorry, Elijah, you go first.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say, I also agree as well. You know, my experience as Stryker, you know, we did a pre-submission, you know, for a product. And, you know, based on the FDA feedback on that pre-sub, they asked us to do a de novo. So I think the best way to go about it is to do a Q-sub, and you can get FDA, you know, thinking on your product or the situation. And, you know, that would kind of, you know, let you know, what's the next step on that product. So Q-sub is the best way to do that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And something else I'd like to just point out is that you need to remember that de novos are relatively new compared to the other types of submissions process for the agency. So there are some groups that are very, very familiar with de novos, right? In the AI software group, almost everything is a de novo, right? But in other groups, they may not be as familiar. So if you're, you know, I would recommend looking at, besides looking at the guidance document, look into de novos to see what group you're going to be potentially submitting it to, see what their kind of experience with it, because, you know, coming from a group that did not have as many de novos initially and started seeing it, I've kind of seen the growing pains and learning pains of the reviewers trying to taking on de novos when they aren't as familiar with those product like submission types, right? So I think in those types of situations, it's even more important to be able to submit or potentially submit a Q-sub to get some feedback before you go into those groups.
Next audience question. What are the best ways to take advantage of a breakthrough device designation? In my experience, I found that the allowable scope for a sprint discussion is so limited that it was quicker to do a pre-sub to answer all of our questions. Maybe last year.
Yeah, it's definitely designed for that, you know, one topic at a time for those sprint discussions. So if you're going to go talk about biocompatibility, you do that in one. If you're going to talk about, you know, your standards testing, you do that in another. It's really the review groups that are going to look at it. I think they work best when you have a long-term, you've got a product that's going to be in clinical trials, or you're doing a modular PMA and you want to have a sprint before you submit each one of those modules. That's really useful to get a really focused and get the group. I think it's also been helpful, we've seen in combination products, because you can get, you know, CEDAR folks in the room as well, which are sometimes difficult to bring to the table.
Okay, next audience question. Loaded question. We have a difficult reviewer who annotated our Q-sub minutes with content that was not stated during the meeting. How do you advise handling that for a class 3 device? Valid disagreement to the minutes or escalate to a higher FDA level?
Yeah, I mean, my experience, I would say you want to escalate to the higher FDA level. You know, if you know the correct FDA leadership team, you know, part of that group, I would take it up to higher up. You know, we did that in the past, you know, for 510K that we worked on. You know, the review was very difficult. And my experience with the FDA, I know all the reviewers' bosses, so I can pick up the phone and call them up and talk to them directly. So I also go to the reviewer, leadership team and talk to them directly.
I'm going to give the opposing, because the last one of these I had, we did a meeting minute disagreement and we were able to negotiate the questionable language out of the minutes and add some clarifying text that, didn't commit us to something we didn't want to commit to. So it sounds like both paths would be acceptable.
Yeah, I would kind of lean more towards Nancy as well. I think there are times where there are disagreements. I think if you can't get to, I guess the first step is making sure that your salient points are in agreement, right? That maybe the little details might be a wash, but the main important points are in agreement. And if you can't, FDA actually has their CTS code is agree to disagree, which you don't see that off for Q-sub minutes, but it does happen where you just can't get to an agreement. And then, since it is a non-binding feedback, they log it as a disagreement in their file moving forward. I would say that's not the preferable option to agree to disagree. And that's usually when communication breaks down that you can't get to that point. So hopefully most situations I've seen is that you generally can reach some form of agreement before reaching that agree to disagree button.
Yeah, I would agree with that the combination approach is always the best. It's the first, but I do not, absolutely there should be a meeting to say that there is a conflict or just, a disagreement. Like you said, agree to disagree, that there's a disagreement in the minutes of the meeting. Usually in these pre-sub meetings, there's more than one reviewer and usually only in more than one person from your company, who was taking, notes and minutes of the meeting. So it would be good to have a follow-up meeting with them and say, this was information that was not discussed during the meeting, and see how far you go. Now, you can always reserve the right to go higher, but before going higher, I would have, as Nancy suggested, your disagreement meeting.
Yeah, I think it also goes back to the best meeting practices is that you do reserve those last 5 minutes of the meeting to really restate the agreements coming out of the meeting. And that it's much easier to resolve it when you're still in the meeting than after the minutes come out.
I think that is really good advice. Most of us, and I as they say, I'm guilty as, we run right up, FDA usually only gives you 1 hour and you run right up to the hour. So it is good advice. And we've tried to do that now in our Q-sub meetings is the last 5 minutes to say, we're almost, finished with the meeting. Even if there's some additional questions or information, let's review what we've either agreed on or discussed. Or we've also said, perhaps we need another Q-sub to discuss these points either that we haven't gotten to or that we don't seem to have agreement on. But that is good advice, Nancy.
Yeah, and I think Elijah's approach, I would say, is more of like a final resort that if, we tried everything that Judy and Nancy was saying and we couldn't, then maybe that's when you try to escalate it. But otherwise, I would say as a reviewer, if someone called my associate director right up a disagreement, I'm not sure I would be the happiest.
Don't make your reviewer mad. Good advice. I have a couple more audience questions. Follow up to one from before. Does being a breakthrough device make the de novo path a bit easier? I think we've had breakthroughs and de novos. I don't know if you've had a breakthrough that went de novo. That's a complicated scenario. Anybody have that?
I would say breakthrough designation in general just makes your process easier. So if you can get a breakthrough designation for any type of submission, de novo, PMA, even the rare 510K, I would say just that level of oversight, the fact that you're prioritized review, there's deadlines you can meet with FDA, I think makes the process overall just smoother for any type of marketing submission.
So audience question, this one is interesting related to COVID. Has anyone had experience using 510K third-party review in one of the COVID-heavy offices like OHT1, OHT4, OHT7? We were told 510Ks would be delayed this year in the IVD office, and we're concerned of how long the process would take. So is using third-party a good alternative? What do you think?
For me, I've not used a third party, submission group yet, but, I've talked to third party group and I've, received quotes from third party, group as well. Based on their success rate, they told me they were pretty successful. So I would not discourage the use of third party. I think it's a great source to use with the FDA because it kind of gets you faster, FDA clearance because they try to address all those questions in their review. So I think if you have the tool and money to use a third party, I highly recommend using the FDA third party program. I think it's a great program, in my opinion.
We've not used third parties at all for any reviews of our 510Ks, but that's good advice, Elijah.
We've had good and bad experiences. I think we did a whole live episode on our goods and bads. I don't think we've done any this year, in the past year during COVID. No one's requested one, so that's an interesting question. Okay, last question of the day. What trends and submissions are you seeing? Is there anything that you guys are seeing in your submissions right now that would be interesting to share? Nancy, you want to go first?
Sure. So we're seeing human factors bubble back up to the top. It was really active and then it got quiet for a while. And now we're starting to see those questions come back again. And, one review division in particular, I know has a new human factors reviewer. And so they're bringing fresh eyes and perspective and reading the guidance documents again and asking lots of questions, even on devices that are pretty similar to things that are on the market or pretty close to their predicate. We're being asked to justify that human factors and really the justifications aren't working too well.
Let's bring human factors back to the forefront during COVID. Anybody else?
Yeah, we're seeing, we have several PMAs and, and we've had them for many years. So, we have a team that's, very adept at the PMA supplements for manufacturing changes, however, we're seeing a lot of pushback from FDA on our annual reports, not on the PMAs, we're seeing it some with the PMA supplements for some manufacturing changes, but on the annual reports, which are usually pretty straightforward, especially, with a group that's pretty experienced, we're seeing a lot, not only of questions, but a request for changes that we've already evaluated that would not, require a PMA supplement, requesting multiple PMA supplements from annual reports. So we're seeing this very routinely now, so we don't know if it's a factor with new reviewers reviewing PMA supplements, but it's concerning for us as a company.
Let's finish up with Amelia. Amelia, what are you seeing in the software world?
I think since the release of the Smart Review template, I think we've definitely seen an increase in requests. So cybersecurity became a hot topic. Off-the-shelf software, which is an old guidance document that nobody had ever brought up ever in a review, which came up. Usability, like Nancy was saying, because I think, if you go through that Smart Review template, especially if you're on the software side, and you kind of look through some of the questions, like one of them is protection from malware and transportation. I don't think that was ever really included in anyone's software submissions or even a consideration. So now if you don't review that and you go to do a submission, you're going to get some questions that you could easily knock off, but they will be surprising. I think the other surprising thing is the focus on cybersecurity in submissions, considering the fact that the pre-market guidance document is still in draft, although I think it's on the A list for 2021. So we'll see what comes of that. But I think internationally as well, definitely we're just seeing this across the board, not just in the United States.
Yeah, Lisa, I was going to say, I agree with Amelia. I've worked on a lot of devices that contain software and mobile application. And what I would say is, based on my experience, FDA has been asking a lot of questions on wireless connectivity and cybersecurity. So what I suggest to manufacturers, try to get a third-party consultant who understands that space, when it comes to pre-market, because you'll receive a lot of questions. We gotta withdraw a 510K because of that, and then redo the entire submission. So it's a serious issue at the FDA right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists today. We are out of time, but that was a good discussion. Back to you, Rachel.
Thank you all so much. That was fantastic. Lisa, Amelia, Judy, Elijah, Kevin. And so thank you so much for that. Okay, we are going to switch gears to our next presentation, and I am going to introduce Sean Burke from Duane Morris to take things over.
Thank you, Rachel. Appreciate it. As Rachel mentioned, Sean Burke, and I'm a partner at the law firm of Duane Morris in our Washington, D.C. office. I'm also vice chair of our products liability trial division, where I focus my practice on advising and defending life sciences companies against the threat of products liability litigation. From listening to that last great panel and the questions, it's obvious that a lot of people on this call have extensive experience with the 510K and the FDA review processes, and also with FDA compliance in general. What I'm here to talk about today is what happens down the road with those files 5, 10, 15 years later in the unfortunate event if your company is sued in a product liability context for the product subject to those files, and how the evidence of those files is then used by both sides at trial. And so I'm just going to go ahead and share some slides. And so it should come as no surprise to those of you on the call that this evidence of FDA compliance, whether in the pre-market submission context or later on in the post-market surveillance context, is some strong evidence to the benefit typically of the device or drug manufacturer. The ability to show that you complied with FDA regulations, that you acted pursuant to those standards, is something that's very powerful often in the mind of the jury. There are two main areas which I'm going to focus on as I set forth here. The first will be the regulatory pathway, the clearance process, the pre-market approval process. The second bucket or group of evidence I'll talk about is on the compliance side. And in particular, I'll be focused on complaint tracking and reporting. So in connection with the strength of that evidence, the plaintiff's bar in particular has tried their best to undermine the strength of FDA compliance evidence at trial. And on the regulatory pathway side, I'll focus on the 510K process. And what they've done is they've kind of painted the 510K process for devices as a loophole. As many of you on this call, I'm sure, are very well aware, most of devices in the US at this time are brought to market through the 510K clearance process. And that's a process where the FDA determines whether or not the product is substantially equivalent to a device previously cleared or approved. And so what the plaintiff's bar has done is suggested this is a shortcut, it's a loophole, it's a rubber stamp. They'll, of course, try to compare it to the much more rigorous PMA process. They'll show the stacks of paper required for a PMA, the amount of time required for a PMA, and, of course, the cost of the PMA, and suggest the 510K process is a shortcut compared to that, and is a loophole that manufacturers try to exploit to bring a product to market as quickly as possible, and then it's not a finding by the FDA of safety and efficacy. And they've been very successful, the plaintiff's bar have, in advancing this narrative. In fact, here is some language from our own U.S. Supreme Court. Granted, this was in a different context, the context of preemption, but you can see here the Supreme Court's own take on the 510K process, where they say it's nowhere near comparable to the PMA process. And this quote at the end is definitely troubling for manufacturers trying to get this evidence in at trial. Section 510K notification requires little information, rarely elicits a negative response from the FDA, and gets processed very quickly. And so relying on this language and advancing arguments that it does not have anything to do with safety and efficacy, and that if anything, this evidence will just confuse the jury to think the FDA conducted some review they didn't. Many courts do not allow in evidence of 510K clearance. And so that leaves device manufacturers in a tough position of not being able to mention how they got this product on the market. And even further, in situations where device companies may be able to get this evidence into trial, the public perception of this 510K process through documentaries like The Bleeding Edge, many of you may have seen this week John Oliver, there's a perception out there that's led some device companies to actually make the conclusion they're better off not even trying to get this evidence in, and they're just better off not even mentioning the FDA at trial, which is really a far cry from where we were as an industry 10 years ago. All that may be subject to change again. It's potentially a silver lining from the pandemic. I think the pandemic has put the FDA oversight, potentially the constantly evolving life sciences industry, how innovation has to react quickly, all into the limelight. And so I think these issues are maybe now more in the forefront of juries' minds. And to that end, there was a recent decision in New Jersey. Two manufacturers, Ethicon and Bard, were sued for product defects relating to their mesh products. They tried to get in evidence of their 510K clearance, and the court did not allow that evidence in at trial. They were hit with a combined $83 million verdicts. The court, excluding that FDA evidence, found that it was not indicative of safety and efficacy, and that it was more likely to confuse the jury and to let them think there was some sort of approval that there really wasn't. Bard and Ethicon appealed that decision, and the whole industry kind of jumped on board to help, led by various industry groups, Stryker, Johnson & Johnson, Medtronic, all jumped in and also assisted with a briefing to argue why this 510K clearance evidence is so important at trial. And they argued, of course, that safety and efficacy still very much is the hallmark of the 510K process. But they also argue that fairness requires that such evidence be admitted at trial. A lot of the allegations are that the manufacturer didn't act reasonably. Some of the allegations are the manufacturers actually acted recklessly or with malicious disregard for patient safety. And it's only fair that these device manufacturers are able to say that, look, we complied with FDA standards, we complied with what the government requires us to do. We didn't just rush these things to the market. We went through the well-proven channel for bringing devices to the public. The court latched onto that fairness argument. They reversed those $83 million verdicts, and they held it was a mistake for the court to exclude that evidence at trial. What the court really jumped on was the fact that to exclude that evidence just wasn't giving device manufacturers a fair shake. And what the court concluded was the exclusion of such evidence at trial could easily have led the jury to incorrectly presume that defendants recklessly sold products with no FDA oversight whatsoever. And the court said that was especially true under the current conditions where in the pandemic, as I mentioned, everyone was becoming more aware of FDA oversight. And for both parties to be silent on that subject would likely lead the jury to conclude that there was no FDA oversight here and that device companies were simply selling this product without any sort of pre-market requirements. And so it's a big win for device companies. It's a step in the right direction, potentially a change in momentum on how this narrative has been going over the past couple of years. Just a couple of takeaways from this holding and just in 510K files and any regulatory file for that matter. Some of the questions before from the panel before I thought were absolutely on point, and I think a good way of thinking about how you keep these files organized. But it's extremely important that you keep your clearance files organized, well documented. Obviously, there are certain requirements on how they're maintained. But I think even more so, for example, there's certain ASTM standards you're complying with, that you are documenting that. If there's an ISO standard that supports the material you're using, that you document that. And as I mentioned, some of these files may not be questioned for 10, 15 years down the road. And obviously, everybody on this meeting knows the life sciences industry is rapidly evolving. And what seemed like a good idea 10 or 15 years ago may not look that way in the public eye now. And so consider this file to be a bit of a time capsule. And so I've seen clients successfully include in these files, maybe it's literature, it could be current studies that they're relying upon, but something that kind of captures why you may be bringing this product to market, maybe issues with other materials currently available for the same devices. And having that sort of snapshot in there will help you down the road to really frame for the jury what you were thinking in that design and development process at the time. And then finally, the other thing I'd mention, obviously, as someone trying to get a product to the market, obviously one of the goals for doing that, the primary goal, is to do so as efficiently and quickly as possible. Obviously, you're trying to do that without a lot of FDA pushback and a lot of questions. The silver lining of that is if you do get questions and some pushback from the FDA, is that you carefully consider those questions. You respond with the information as needed in an organized fashion. Hopefully the FDA reviews that information and then clears the product. And what that does in hindsight is it really helps advance the narrative that this is not a rubber stamp. This is something the FDA is looking at carefully. When they had questions, the manufacturer responded with the information that was requested, and as a result, the FDA cleared the product. That really helps kind of advance that the 510K process does have more teeth than the plaintiff's bar may want to paint to the court and to the jury. And so moving along quickly, I did want to talk a little bit about what I would deem compliance evidence or evidence for post-market surveillance type activities. And this can often be another potentially very valuable piece of evidence. As you know, companies, in particular companies, are obligated to track their complaint data. And this is a great way to combat allegations that a product was defective by showing the big picture on how a product has performed over the history of its being sold. As you know, there is no U.S. registry, and so to the extent that you can present your own internal data, that could often be the best evidence for providing a big picture. Also, because it's usually done through the FDA MDR process, you also get the additional argument of all of these complaints were made available to the FDA, reported to the FDA. The FDA was keeping tabs on the product performance, and they didn't take any action. They didn't send us any concerns. That's all helpful in combating some of these allegations as well. Like the clearance side, though, the plaintiff's bar does appreciate the strength of this evidence, and they have some tactics to try to undermine it. On complaint reporting, for example, really two main ways they do that. One, they challenge the validity of the data itself. Obviously, depending on your company's size, your global reach, the size of your sales force, there are going to be complaints, there are going to be failures that don't get reported to the FDA. And so the plaintiff's bar will use that to kind of suggest that this data can't be trusted, clearly they're missing complaints, you should disregard the entire data and not pay any attention to that. The second is, again, they'll try to undermine the FDA process and the FDA oversight. And this is just an example here on the slide. Some of you may have heard the FDA's separate database that they maintained specific to certain devices that was not made publicly available. The plaintiff's bar jumped on this as the cloak and dagger FDA secret database. Luckily, most courts have kind of acknowledged this doesn't have a lot of relevance to devices that weren't maintained in it. This evidence has been excluded, but this is the type of thing that you may expect in counter to evidence trying to support your favorable complaint data. It's just a general attack on the FDA, a general attack on the data. So a couple quick practice points on that. Obviously, for your complaint system, I think it's important for companies to review messaging to the sales force on complaint reporting. I'm sure most companies have instructions to their distributors, to their sales force, to report any failures. Obviously, it's on hospitals to report failures as well, but in practice, that doesn't always happen. And so to the extent that you're updating your sales manuals, if you're having sales meetings, that you're regularly reminding the sales force of this, all that helps show that you're constantly reinforcing that message, and that hopefully that's resulting in accurate complaint data that you can later rely upon if you need to at trial. And the second one I'd mention is just an open dialogue with surgeon or prescribing users. People often ask me, well, what drives product liability? Why does this product become a target and others don't? And there's a lot of reasons why one product may become a target over others. Obviously, the number of complaints, if the FDA takes any actions, recalls. But to me, one of the biggest reasons is when former surgeon users team up with the plaintiffs and support their cases. I think from a plaintiff's perspective, it's hugely important if you can have a former user or a surgeon consultant who says, I relied on this company, I trusted this company, now I know they withheld data from me, and as a result, a lot of people were injured. That is very powerful testimony, very powerful evidence. It may be impossible to prevent that from happening, but one way you can do that is paying attention to your surgeon complaints now. If they're emailing you or raising complaints, that you're responding to them in a timely fashion and providing them whatever information they need. That is one way to try to prevent this evidence down the road. So that's all I have for my 15 minutes. If anyone has any questions, please let me know. It's a huge area. There's a lot of different ways you can go with this. So please feel free to email me or reach out to me afterwards if we don't have time today. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Sean. That was fantastic.
So I will absolutely take this moment to remind everyone, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A chat. Our speakers are hanging around and we'll be able to kind of answer those individually, but also reach out to our speakers, right? I'm gonna say Viva MedTech, Covington and Berlin, ML Strategies, Dwayne Morris, RQM Plus. They have done a fantastic job of putting this content together for you, and they would love to hear from you. So please take the time, Google them, make sure you know who they are, and reach out with any questions. So take a 2-second, I would say, moment to stand up and stretch. We are over halfway through the program today, and I really appreciate all of you sticking with us. I know it's been some fantastic content, and we have even more great content to go, honestly. So the next session I'm going to introduce is one I'm very excited about, because I'm one of those people that absolutely loves to hear about emerging companies and the small company perspective on things. So I really think you're going to enjoy this one. So Kristen Davenport, I am going to turn things over to you for this incredible session.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'm Kristen Davenport with Covington Burling, and with me, Kate Stolman and Matt King, who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves shortly. Kate and Matt, thank you both for joining. I think a lot of the attendees today are really looking forward to hearing your real life experiences with a lot of the programs and FDA mechanisms and process that a lot of this day has focused on. So before we start really discussing the ins and outs of the FDA process and mechanism, I'd be interested in hearing more from you in terms of your background and the background on your respective companies and products. So Kate, could you start by providing background on Corvia in the intra-atrial shunt device, which I understand is designed to provide decompression of the left atrium to reduce symptoms and progression of heart failure?
Thank you so much, Kristen. I'm Kate Stolman. I'm the regulatory manager for Corvia Medical. Prior to joining Corvia, I worked at 4 other structural heart repair device companies in regulatory positions. And before that, I had 16 years at HP Medical in cardiac ultrasound manufacturing and development work. So I'm very happy to be here today again, and I'll talk about Corvia. Corvia Medical is a startup medical device company. We have that one product, which you nicely described. The idea of the device is to treat heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. These are patients that have elevated left atrial pressure, and this creates a condition that gives them aggravation when they exercise, and is the underpinnings for their heart failure symptoms. Corvia Medical started up its work about 10 years ago. And, of course, like any startup medical device company looking at an implant, began the work with design work and animal studies. And if you turn back the clock 10 years, the early feasibility study opportunities didn't exist back then, and companies like ours began their clinical research offshore, typically in Europe. Corvia began in Australia and European studies, and started, of course, with feasibility studies, a pilot study with maybe 11 patients, and with each successive clinical study, we would add more patients and get more specific about what are the inclusion criteria and what are the criteria by which we determine success. Are there other things that you'd like to know about the company at this point?
Yeah, no, I think we'll get into it as I asked you additional questions about the process, but thank you very much for the introduction. And Matt, likewise, I understand that Active Surgical just received 510K clearance for your first product, the Active side. Could you provide a little background on Active Surgical and your first 510K cleared product before we delve in?
Sure. So Active Surgical is a very small, early stage startup. We're working in surgical imaging. We are an augmentation to current camera systems used in laparoscopic surgery. Our product is an alternative view to the standard of care out there right now, which is called indocyanine green, or ICG fluorescence. Our product doesn't require the dye, so an injection or a dye or anything like that. And it's pretty much real time display of blood perfusion and blood flow in patients who are undergoing surgery. So it allows the surgeon to see probably much more clearly and much more in real time, much more accurately where blood flow is and where blood flow is not. So we received our first 510K clearance for active site on April 8th. Pretty exciting time. That's been it's sort of the platform that we're going to build a lot of the rest of this off. The goal is to eventually get into AI and surgical robots. So a lot of the discussion earlier today, that's a lot of the stuff, you know, a little bit more afield for us, but coming up in the near future. And yeah, it's great company. Very, you know, like I said, it's early stage. I think we have less than 50 employees based in Boston, and we're all doing a lot of everything. So it's there's no, you know, there's nobody that does just one thing in this type of environment. We have R&D people doing verification and validation. You got me doing human factors and all kinds of crazy things. So it's kind of an interesting place.
So as an emerging company, one question that often comes up, you know, you might have a great idea, you might even have a design, something you would really like to study. And when you have a PMA device like Corvia, you're obviously engaging with FDA at the IDE stage because you do need an IDE to move forward. But especially with lower risk devices that you can study, but you know, with IRB approval alone, there is not necessarily this early interaction with FDA. So what would you provide as feedback to other emerging companies as to when to start thinking about engaging with FDA? And I'm thinking both on the study design. Is this something you recommend, early engagement on study design, and also on the regulatory pathway? When is this something that makes sense? And then we'll talk about some mechanisms. But how should emerging companies think about working with FDA, approaching FDA, and at what stage?
Well, okay, I'm happy to start, and that's it's a really interesting question because you know, the regulatory frameworks in countries are changing in real time, and so as I said earlier, you know, 10 years ago the early feasibility study pathway, you know, wasn't really well exercised, and companies would go overseas. Well, now the early feasibility framework is better in the United States than it is in Europe, and it's much more attractive for a company that's going to go through the PMA process to get early clinical feedback in the United States. You know, US physicians are dying to work with new technology and in fact have lots of creative ways to move a program forward. So it's, you know, it's really in a US company's best interest, if it's possible, to consider doing that at home. And but then the question of engagement, you know, I think we heard some very good dialogue in the previous session about the value of pre-submission meetings and what can be gained from them. And, you know, one thing we're seeing from the agency is much more useful written feedback when you give the agency a lot of, you know, information up front. They can give you a lot of feedback coming back, and it may or may not require, you know, an actual meeting because you get their expertise on each of the topics that you submit for questions. And so, for example, with the early feasibility studies, you know, they would much rather you gave them, you know, a big load of Q-sub information. You get feedback relatively rapidly, and that means that when they're reviewing your IDE, they can review it much more swiftly and much more likely to meet their deadlines. So you win and they win both.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think that doesn't matter how low risk your product is or how much you don't believe you've developed your information. I mean, your pre-sub should be very detailed. It should be very comprehensive, but you need to, if you have questions, you need to go ask them. It's better to interact with the FDA than it is to guess. Guessing gets you nowhere, and quite honestly leads to a lot of disappointment. the best bet is to get in early. At Active Surgical, before I got there, the team had their first pre-sub when they were very much in the concept phase of Active Site, and they got a lot of really great feedback that drove how we were going to do our bench testing, how we were going to do our human factors. I mean, you know, it was interesting in the prior conversation when they said, what, you know, what's the weird things going on right now? What popped up? And they said human factors. Well, my experience is human factors never went away. It's always been sort of like this, I don't know, black box, you know, like you want to do it right, you try to do everything right, and you still miss something. Well, it's better to miss one thing than to miss 7 or 8 things or 10 or 15 things, because the guidance document can be difficult to understand. IEC 62366 can be kind of difficult to understand. So these are elements that people need to go in and get the thinking of that team. Understanding, especially if you're going way very early, the team may change. So whatever feedback you've just gotten, they were talking about turnover there or people moving around, you may have a human factors reviewer in, you know, January of 2019 that's a different person in, you know, July of 2020. So you just got to be prepared for that. That being said, you just get so much good data from them and you build a relationship. There is relationship building here, trust, and just I think, as Kate put it perfectly, you know, they're not looking at these things for the first time when they get that IDE submission, when they get that 510K, when they get whatever units unlocked, the de novo, you know, you're not surprising them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I agree. Now, in terms of the pre-submission package, and I think both of you mentioned having a comprehensive package. Oftentimes, you know, there are questions. Well, what should we put in the package? Should it be a high-level overview or a protocol, or you know, just a number of questions that we want feedback on? What's your take? What's most helpful if you actually present a full protocol and seek feedback on it? If you start with high-level questions, how should one think really using the pre-submission program and going about preparing a package to really, even though it's relatively short feedback, it's still, or a short time frame, it's still 60 to 75 days. So every time you submit a pre-submission, it does take, you know, 2 to 3 months. And so you do want to get the maximum amount of feedback really in one sitting. So how do you go about making that happen in your experience?
Well, my advice is that, you know, first of all, a Q-sub prior to your early feasibility study is very different from the Q-sub that you might have when you're contemplating the amendment to a PMA protocol, a pivotal protocol. So there's a life cycle that might be 10 years long, right. That you know, different questions are important at different points in the life cycle, but you don't want to be treating the FDA like a consulting company. The FDA isn't going to tell you how to do your job. What you have to do is demonstrate that you are sort of ready for the next step. And the way that you demonstrate that is to put together a pre-submission package with a suitable amount of information at a suitable level of detail that convinces the FDA that if they give you feedback now, you know, that you will use it appropriately, and that will get you to the next step. So you know, you neither want to reach too far, you don't want to hold back a tremendous amount of information. You want to have good depth that indicates your understanding the regulations and the guidances that are associated with the questions that you want to have answered. And you want to be very clear about what it is that you're trying to achieve in that pre-sub meeting. You know, is it, you know, a preliminary review of the approach that you're taking, or, you know, we've gotten to this point and we're uncertain whether we should do this or that. You want, you know, good depth, good clarity, and a demonstration that you know what it's going to take to the next step.
Yeah, and to your point, I think a proposal that you know you have specific questions on and you are putting forth, I think is very important. I mean, what you really don't want to do is say, we have this device, what should our clinical study look like, and keep it open-ended. It's probably not a good idea. So you really want to have a good proposal that you're putting in front of FDA that you have, thought about, and that makes sense for your device, for the indication, with regard to the endpoints, you think makes sense for that particular study, and then get very specific feedback on it.
With respect to the protocol, most studies have been done similar to the study that you're proposing to do, but your strongest source of information on how to do the next study in that body of clinical information is really going to come from the physicians that you're working with, and you'll want to be talking to statisticians before you talk to the FDA, so that you've built a framework for your protocol that is current from a medical point of view and current from a statistical approach point of view. It's not something where, so when you're approaching the FDA with a Q-sub on your clinical protocol, you should have a framework already worked out that is not 15 years old with respect to the state of the art.
Yeah, I think that it's important, it kind of piggybacking on that, you're not going there to ask them for permission on how you're going to conduct things. Your goal is to show them you know what you're doing, and that what you're presenting is the right way to do it. And you want agreement with them, but you also want to know where they feel the soft spots may be that they need to. What you're trying to do is prevent questions later on down the line. You're trying to answer the questions before you get into the review phase, because questions during review phases take time, and there's just no way around that. Between 510Ks and PMAs, when you start getting questions, everything goes on hold, and so you've got to rush to finish those, but you got to be very good at completing them. So you want to minimize. So you want them to come back and say, I think you should redo biocompatibility, because some of those tests can take up to 10 weeks or longer. So there's a lot of things that you want to go in there and say, look, I know what I need to do for biocompatibility. Here's where ISO 10993 applies to us. Here's where it does not. Here's where my drug interaction may be. Here's where it is not. This is where my V&V needs to go. This is the human factors that I'm going to do. And when you're going to propose your clinical study, I think that Kate put it perfectly. You're going in there saying, this is the study I'm going to war with. I need to know where your comments are going to be. You're not asking for them to help you write that. If you ask for that, they're just going to give you a blank stare. And a lot of people, I've run into people who said, you're going to go in there and ask them, I'm making these changes to my device. Do I have to do a 510K? The answer is going to be yes. So don't go in there and ask that question. You go in there and you say, I'm not doing a 510K for these changes. I'll put them in my next 510K to clear the deck, but here's why. If you're going to have that kind of a discussion, you got to let them. The whole goal here is to let them know you know what you're doing. And another element I think that is important. Somebody once said that with a pre-sub, you get one shot at the apple, but I disagree with that. Because you can't supplement these. So when you do a Q-sub, you get the meeting, you come back, you've got additional questions or some things that you want to clarify. Somebody was talking about the, earlier about, the annotations that were not part of the discussion. Ask for clarification. You've still got opportunities. You can send in SO1 through SOX. It doesn't matter how far you go. You can keep on supplementing that to get information from them, as long as you're asking for real information. As long as you're not just, trying to get them to, cough up, what cards they have, because you're not gonna win that point.
Right. No, I agree. And to your point, when you go in for your first pre-sub meeting, you may not have the full protocol yet, because you may want to have the initial discussions as to whether your primary endpoint is even appropriate, such that, you might want to just get some initial feedback on what you're thinking in terms of the protocol, and then you can come in with the full protocol for review and get additional feedback. So yeah, I think, oftentimes there'll be more than one pre-sub meeting, and that makes a lot of sense. Kate, following up on a comment that you made, that oftentimes, there is foreign data on a device. And so many times, we see companies come in that may already be marketing in Europe, or at least have collected data in Europe. To what extent do you think the data can be used, or really both of you, what's your experience in being able to use foreign data? And if so, would that be enough, or do you think it can be used as a starting point to be supplemented with US data, or have either of you had any experience in having those discussions with FDA?
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, foreign data is, any data is valuable data. And, it really comes down to, well, how do you want to use that data? And to what end? How strong is the data? So, the FDA's objective is to understand the safety and the effectiveness of the device before they approve it. And they can, you can use foreign data to, skip, early feasibility and go straight to randomizing, or you can use foreign. In fact, there are devices that have been approved in the United States, a PMA entirely based on foreign data. The FDA, they like to see US hospitals participating in your pivotal trial, but it's not a legal requirement that they do. So, but the important thing is that when you do work in another country, is that you do it according to international standards, like the ISO 14155 standard for clinical trials, the Declaration of Helsinki, that you're using modern international standards for the quality of the protocol and the data collection and the ethical requirements of collecting that data, even patient confidentiality. And so that when you bundle that data together, it looks like data that you would collect from any first world country. And that being said, there are many, many countries in the world that can put together a program that will deliver high quality clinical data.
And I think that the statement that I heard from somebody once is that bench data is good, animal data is better, clinical data is great, and real world data is the greatest. FDA is less concerned about where you get the data than what the actual data is. So if your study was in Europe, I think the biggest area they're gonna question you on is demographics, age groups, the populations you selected, in the N. That's that. And it's interesting, the discussions I've seen the most in pre-subs with the FDA about clinical studies is how many subjects. Everybody, we want to do fewer because a lot of patients is expensive and time consuming, enrolling, running them through the protocol. There's the prep work, and then there's the follow-up work. And then there's the cost, become extremely expensive. And then, but on the flip side of that is what's a suitable end. So I think that, as Kate said, as long as you go in there with a really good biostatistical argument that I powered this the right way, I have the right end, I have the right demographics, the right age groups, right representation, they're not really going to be that concerned about where that data is coming from, as long as it's legitimate data. So that's, and I think that the inverse is true as well, where in Europe, they will look at US FDA data and say, you've got good data here. We can use that in your conformity assessment. So the rules change a little bit under the MDR, but at it all, as Kate was talking about, the European standards are all still fairly the same. The ICH6 and all the other areas.
Yeah, and you just also mentioned real-world data, and I think that's another piece to consider for an emerging company, approaching FDA, because there really have been, especially recently, been a focus on real-world data and potential value of real-world data out there. So there really is value in looking what kind of data already exists, whether it's foreign data, whether it's real world data in the US, registries, user surveys, or so forth. Not that it's going to be sufficient in every case, or even in many cases, but it at times can be a very good start and at least serve as supplemental data. Although as we have seen, and especially probably especially in a 510K context, it can sometimes be enough to have a combination of foreign and real world data.
It's good. It's good to have it for your toolbox. It's certainly, it's never going to hurt you. It's not going to get you a PMA approval. It may not even get you a 510K clearance if there are special controls that are required for it that say you have to do clinical. But in a whole picture, it can help round that picture out very, very nicely. As you said, registry studies, literature studies, other similar device performance, predicate device performance, things like that. So it can help. It will rarely get you 100% over the line, but no, I mean, clinical studies will always be or I shouldn't say, they are currently the standard that the FDA expects for the higher risk devices.
Yeah. Now, one other question I wanted to, we were talking about study design earlier. So one other question I wanted to circle back to is, I think one question that often comes up and is, when you do initiate an IDE, does that mean that FDA agrees with the clinical study design? If the fact that you get IDE approval, does that have any essentially implicit sign off on your clinical study design? And I think, we know the answer is no. It just means that you have demonstrated that you're meeting the IDE threshold to be able to initiate the clinical study. It doesn't mean that your trial design will necessarily be sufficient or adequate to support a marketing authorization later on. And the agency makes that clear in issuing study design considerations. How do you address study design considerations, or what would be your feedback to companies in considering them? If they get an IDE approval, would you say, let's just move forward? You have the IDE approval, you're allowed to clinically study your device, or do you think there really is a need, or at least a high value in really considering the study design considerations before you move on with the clinical trial?
Well, certainly it's important to understand the basis on which these recommendations are coming. And there's really, you have three possibilities. You can ignore them and hope that your own idea is of sufficient strength. You can agree with them and make an amendment to your protocol and move in the direction that the FDA thinks that they would like you to go. Or you have a third option, and that is to challenge them. And it's better to do that as early in the process as possible and not wait to the end, because if you can close out a line of questions or disagreement or insufficient understanding by bringing to bear more expertise, clinical experts that may have a very deep understanding of from whence the FDA's recommendation is coming and what's happened in the clinical community since then, that can be really valuable in the long run. And it's important because the FDA puts those thoughts in writing in the letter, the future considerations letter. Well, at some point you have to address everything in that letter, whether it's a question about a component of your IDE, such as a biocompatibility test result, or it's a design of your pivotal trial design consideration. You do have to address everything that they've asked as a future consideration when you write in your PMA. But if you've already closed those topics, back at the very beginning, even before you've enrolled patients, and you can point to that in your, when you do the PMA modular submission, you're in a much better position.
If you're a small company and I'm going to predicate all this with, I have got limited experience with going at it with the FDA over clinical study design. I've supported teams that do that, but I've watched experts, some experts, go down and really work with the FDA hard and challenge them and agree with them and disagree with them and all that, but in very professional fashion to finally get everybody to a spot where they were happy. I think that an IDE approval, which is kind of a fun term because they just don't say anything. So you can start the study after 30 days. If they say it's good for you to go for a feasibility study, that's input. That's not going to tell you that your pivotal study is, just take that one and make it bigger. It's not going to be like that. You got to be ready to pivot and shape your study as you go. When you think about the cost of conducting your pivotal, and you think about the cost of submitting your PMA, and you think of the cost of all of the V&V work and all the production control work that you have to do for that submission, and this is again for a class 3 product or a high risk product, I should say. You want to know that the study you're going to do is acceptable to the FDA. Will they ever be 100% happy with it? No. These are like parents. They're, you know, you can always do a little bit better. They're always going to treat it a little bit like that. There's no perfect thing in their mind. All they think is, you know, more is better. And you're kind of fighting in the other direction, saying, look, I don't want to, you know, I don't want to go in there with 2 subjects and say everybody survived and we're good. You want to go in there and you all want to be assured that you pick the right approach. Again, being ready to pivot on that there's no resting when you're doing this. That's what I've always observed in the clinical stage companies. There's no resting. In a 510K, like a IRB study, a low risk study, you have a lot more degrees of freedom. You're still subject to certain elements of the IDE regulations, but you're not really subject to the whole FDA back and forth. You're subject to that with an IRB. Once the IRB gives you the green light, you know, if they give you the green light, then conduct the study. You have minimal reporting, you know, requirements and responsibilities. It's a different ball game altogether, and it's a lot cheaper. So those are just things. Going out to do a PMA or a pivotal study to support a de novo, pivotal study to support a high risk class 2 device. You don't want to take a chance. You don't want to say, well, I'm right, they're wrong, because you're not gonna win that fight. You're not gonna win that argument.
Thank you. That's very helpful feedback. And what I'm hearing from you is really early on in the process, you know, figure out, well, either, you know, address all of the comments and or challenge them early on, such that you're not conducting a study that, you know, FDA has previously told you is inappropriate or insufficient, and don't wait until after the study is done and you're really in a process of seeking clearance or approval. Now, moving on to a different topic that there is a lot of interest in currently, which is breakthrough designation. And it's always been a process that companies have been very interested in, but recently through the CMS rule and the associated reimbursement really has become even more, has gained even more interest, I would say, in the medical device community. So both of you, I know, have experience with the breakthrough process. And I think what a lot of companies would really like to hear is, one, what kind of information should you present in your breakthrough designation request? What level of data do you need? And what do you really need to show? Because oftentimes the question is, you know, is this something that's a candidate? What kind of data should I present in a breakthrough designation request? And then 2, once you receive it, what do you see as the biggest benefit of having breakthrough designation?
Kevin, Matt, do you want to start this one?
Sure. So my experience, just a few years old, working in the breakthrough device program, and I didn't get to see it through to the end, but the submission that you make to the FDA, you're selling a concept to them that I am novel and I meet an unmet need, a pretty significant unmet need. So the hard part there is that if there are other devices out there that are achieving what you're going to achieve, you have to show the differentiation, and it's not about cost, it's about benefit to the patient overall. And so there's the data you got to provide. It's very scaled based on what if you're coming in out of left field with a product that nobody's ever thought about, there's a pretty good shot that, you know, and there's a significant healthcare issue around this that is unmet or is inadequately met, and you're going to push it up over, you know, a pretty high number. And you've got all that data. You've got people that will, you know, KOLs that will speak on your behalf and say, this thing would change the game with this particular disease. You're going to have a pretty easy time making that argument. And at that point, you really just got to go through the guidance document, answer the questions, and present it back to them adequately. If you're in a crowded space, or if you're in a race with some other products, you're going to, there's the age-old thing. You've got to get it in fast, but you've got to do a really, really good job of it. You've got to overwhelm them. You've got to so you should know who the other players are and say, well, if I'm going to be competing against company X and I have a good idea of what they're going to put out there, I need to be different than them, because someone's going to get the breakthrough designation. And if you want it to be you've got to do, it's kind of like anything else. You got to do a better job than them.
Mm-hmm.
What are the benefits? I mean, if the initial benefit everybody saw was automatic CMS. You know, you get a CPT code on the day that you get that approval or clearance or de novo designation. That's a huge deal. Talk about, I watched the CEO of a company work for 3 straight years, you know, breaking his back to get CMS coverage for a product that clearly deserved it. And just the frustration, the going down to DC and lobbying and getting the door slammed in your face and getting, you know, a different answer every time. I mean, we think the FDA can be somewhat nebulous or big and you know, faceless. CMS is difficult. And it's, you know, because they get a lot of things to balance out. And you want to get a CPT code that you can keep, because you can see what happens when CPT codes get changed and all of a sudden your reimbursement went from, you know, 100% down to 5%. Companies go out of business in weeks because of that. So that's the big thing. Obviously, that's in question right now, unfortunately. And that's a little scary, because that is one of the biggest benefits of breakthrough.
Right.
The other benefits, the secondary benefits, the really good regular communication with the FDA, the sprint program of getting down there for pre-subs, it can be overwhelming for people. It can be tough to keep up with. You might wind up having 3 pre-subs in a row, 3 months in a row, where you're talking about the same thing because you didn't solve it in the first 2. And you may not get all the things in that you want. And I think that going, you know, what do you want to talk about in pre-subs? I always say, know what you know and talk about what you don't know. So if you know you've got a biocompatibility profile you've got to do, don't try to argue with them out of it. They're not going to do that. There's no bargaining. So if you got to go down there and talk about your pivotal study, talk about it. You know, make that the thing you talk about the most. You got to go down there and talk about software verification, validation. Do it. Make that you know. Don't go down there and talk to them about things that you know, how my firmware is going to look or my hardware or. I mean, you want to talk about human factors too, because that's always a little crazy out there. So that's my advice. And
maybe Kate can address this, but probably a lot of participants have the question of, well, how much time does it really save? So for a pre-sub, you have 60 to 75 days. What are you practically looking at in terms of, if you're sending, if you have a question for FDA, how quickly do you get feedback when you're in a breakthrough program?
Well, we definitely, we're getting very good response from the FDA. And I think, you know, you could say, oh, well, that's because, you know, you're working on a pivotal trial for a PMA product. And, you know, the FDA does focus its key knowledgeable people on those class 3 device applications and in the pivotal trial on an ongoing basis. But, and if you look at the breakthrough device designation, it really has as much to do with, you know, the really clearly articulating the unmet need. And, but there might be multiple devices that get the same breakthrough device designation because they're all working on the same, you know, real honest to God unmet need with, you know, very high system costs associated with those clinical requirements. Now, does the breakthrough device plus the fact that you're working on a PMA, you know, double charge your access to the FDA? Maybe it does. I think that the FDA is very aware of those devices that are working on, you know, big ticket unmet needs, you know, from a public health point of view. And you know, we definitely feel like we enjoy, you know, very rapid turnaround for the questions that we ask. If we put in a pre-sub, we always hear back within 30 days. It doesn't necessarily mean that we've had a meeting within 30 days, but we always hear back in a constructive way within 30 days. And then, you know, amendment regular submissions when they go in, you know, really get swift attention as well. So we really do believe that the breakthrough device designation is beneficial. What it does is it formalizes this concept that we're working on something that's really very important to the community.
Now, we're almost wrapping up, but a final question I have for both of you is, getting the PMA approval or getting the 510K clearance or the de novo is only really part of the story, right? Once you want to market, there are a lot of other considerations. There's the product launch, there is promotion, there is your quality system and making sure that that's all set up prior to manufacturing. What are some of the things that you should start thinking about early on, and maybe, you know, while you're pursuing your 510K clearance, PMA or de novo, that you will need in order to market and launch the product, and that you should really start preparing for and considering early on and throughout the process in order to make your life easier once you do get the approval or clearance or de novo grant?
Yeah, I'd say that, you know, getting a 510K clearance is a great feeling. The hard work is ahead of you now. You know, not to say that they're easy to get, but it's definitely different than a PMA or a de novo. The best thing you can do, because you're going to move fast, hopefully, you know, I think as Kate was saying earlier, some PMA products you could be working on them for 8-10 years before you actually get to the submission point. 510K, 18 to 24 months should be a reasonable amount of time if you have a good concept and you've got a good plan. Your quality system requirements, you know, in a 510K, the FDA does not review your production. They don't look at production controls. They don't look at, you know, purchasing controls or anything like that. They are looking at your design and your risk mitigation. So you got to have design control. You've got to have risk analysis, risk management at the earliest stage. Those are probably the, you know, and document control so that you can track everything. Those are pretty basic fundamentals to doing this. If you don't have that, then you got people working on documents and everybody's going, who did what and when did this, what was the input for that? You know, who came up with that idea? It becomes very messy. The other part of it is that why not just go all the way and get your whole quality system in place? You don't need an ISO certificate to get into the market in the US, but pretend like you are and at least have the framework there so that you're not trying to do that at the same time that you're trying to transfer your design, get into your manufacturing, whether you're going to self-manufacture or use a contract manufacturer. There's just so many wrinkles either way. And then there's, you know, the process, production controls, marketing, sales channels, getting out into the market. It's not just boom, I'm going to, you know, everyone's going to start buying from me. The other thing is that whatever you've got through your 510K, it's changed since that 510K submission was made. So how did you manage your design changes? How did you manage your, you know, how different is the product today than what you got cleared by the FDA? And what can you say about it without, you know, violating, you know, the rules around a new 510K, marketing and promotion, and, you know, mislabeling, mispromotion, all those things.
So what you're saying is, I mean, really, you should have everything lined up by the time you get your 510K clearance. So you have a quality system, you have your promotional guidelines and documents such that on the day that you get your 510K clearance, you would technically be ready to launch.
Yeah. Post-market surveillance, start thinking about that early.
Yep.
All these things, they're not easy to implement once you get going. It's the old joke is that it's not fun to fly a plane while you're putting the fuselage on.
Kate, do you have any additional thoughts?
I totally agree with Matt's thinking on that. You know, design controls begin on day one, and the better your documentation practices are internally, the easier it is to make those regulatory submissions, because they, you know, very much depend on the quality of the protocol, the test protocols and the test reports that are being produced by the same engineering team that's documenting the design of the product. So you know, even the very smallest design team at the very beginning of a program needs to have an experienced medical device engineer who knows what it takes to produce, you know, documentation of the quality necessary to get an FDA approval.
Well, thank you both very much. We are out of time. I really enjoyed speaking to both of you, and I found your feedback and insights immensely helpful, and I hope everyone else likewise enjoyed our little chat.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you to Kate and Matt for your great insight. If there are a couple of questions in the QA tab, maybe a couple of you could stick around and see if you can answer any unanswered questions. We're going to move right now into our congressional update. And to host this session is our friend and colleague, Anthony DeMeo at ML Strategies. And today he'll have with him Caitlin Hodgkins. She's the policy director for the House Rules Committee of Democrats and a longtime aide to Chairman McGovern. Anthony, why don't you take us away with this portion of the program, and then we'll move into our closing keynote with Trang Cox.
Sure thing, Brian. Thank you very much. And you know, it's nice to be called a friend, and it really is a privilege to work with MassMEDIC, and a pleasure to make this presentation today. So thank you for the invitation. And as Brian said, we're especially fortunate, and I'm excited to introduce my co-presenter, Caitlin Hodgkins. She is, in fact, the policy director for the majority staff of the House Rules Committee. She is an expert on congressional procedure, democratic politics, to the extent anyone can be an expert on something like democratic politics. And I think if there's something to know in Congress, she knows it. And if she doesn't know it, then nobody knows it. But enough for me. I'm going to give Caitlin an opportunity to tell the group a little bit about, well, tell them about yourself, the Rules Committee, and your role. How about that?
Thanks so much, Anthony. What a kind introduction. And I want to thank all of you for having me here today. You know, the medical device industry is an economic engine for my home state of Massachusetts. I grew up in Worcester and for our region. And so it's so great to be here with so many innovators who are really driving growth in my community and across our Commonwealth and across the region. So as Anthony mentioned, my name is Caitlin. I work for Chairman McGovern. Prior to moving over to his committee staff, I spent many years in his personal office. So some of you who are from the Worcester area or from Western Mass, we may have crossed paths in the past. So hello again, and to those of you I haven't met, hi. So a little bit about the Rules Committee. We set the agenda for the House floor, working very closely with Majority Leader Hoyer and Speaker Pelosi in determining which bills, how bills are going to be debated and which amendments will be considered on the floor. We have to work very closely with the various interests within our caucus, you know, from the conservative Blue Dogs to the very progressive members of the Progressive Caucus and everything in between. And so we play a role in having those conversations and bringing everybody together and getting everybody in a good place. Chairman McGovern is always like, make everyone happy all the time. As you all know, that's not possible, but we do strive to try to work out issues that may arise. And so that's kind of the role that the Rules Committee plays. We have our hand in every major piece of legislation that comes to the House floor. So we are always busy. There's never a dull moment, but it also means that, you know, you all should feel free through Anthony, if there's items that may be coming through Congress that are of interest to you, or if you want to reach out directly, please let me know. I want to be a resource and responsive to your concerns and any questions you may have. So that's a little bit about me, about rules, about what we do. So Anthony, I'll kick it back to you.
Thanks, Caitlin. I can attest that Caitlin is very responsive and a tremendous resource. So to really take her up on that. Can you tell us a little bit about the activity the House has undertaken in the first few months of the year since this Congress convened, and perhaps more importantly, what we can anticipate from now until the end of the calendar year? You know, and then of course we're in an election year. So obviously, there's been a lot of activity, you know, gigantic stimulus bill passed in the early part of the year in February. But what does that mean for the calendar the rest of the way? Yeah,
so the new Congress started in January, and we had for the first time in a decade, we had a unified government. We had a Democratic president and a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate, which means all of those parties work very expeditiously to try to get their priorities through. And I think, the first thing, this was an especially unique time given that we're in the midst of a pandemic. And so we made it a priority in the first few months of the Congress to advance the American Rescue Plan, which was a gigantic undertaking for a brand new administration. And luckily we had 2 years practice in the majority on the House side, but a new majority over on the Senate side. And so almost every committee had an input on that bill. It was huge. It had spent a lot of money, and there were a lot of different provisions. I know there was some healthcare, obviously a down payment on a lot of important healthcare priorities, but we had nutrition support and everything in between. So it was a huge undertaking, and we did it in like 2 months, which is sort of unheard of for a massive bill of that size and magnitude. But I think it is a testament to how important it was to the administration and to our majority. We sort of had, that mandate. People wanted to see further response to the pandemic. And so since that time, we've been working on other longstanding Democratic priorities. Last week, we did the Paycheck Fairness Act. We've been working on police reform and gun violence prevention, among a whole number of others. But those are just a couple that kind of stick out in my mind at the moment. So looking forward, I think there are a few really big ticket items that Congress will be focused on. Obviously, infrastructure is another huge priority of the administration, and for many members of Congress and for our leadership too. It's an opportunity not only to create jobs, but to invest in crumbling infrastructure. And boy, do we know about that in Massachusetts. My boss likes to say we have roads and bridges older than some states that members represent. So, I know how important that is to our region and our economy and our growth. So the president sent up his infrastructure proposal. We are awaiting his kind of second round, which is going to be human infrastructure. We think it's going to cover things like childcare and education. There may be some health stuff in there, family and medical leave. It's going to be another ambitious proposal, likely $1 trillion or maybe even more. What we don't exactly know is the shape that it's going to take as it moves through Congress. There's this conversation going on. Is it going to be one bill or two bills? Is it going to be all packaged together? Is it going to be pared down? And a lot of that is going to depend on how the House can actually proceed and get that bill through, given the slim majority. So there's going to be a lot of conversation. What we do know is the Speaker has said that she wants to complete work on that by August recess. So I would say that's probably going to take up quite a bit of our time in the next several weeks and months.
That's helpful. I think, it's good to know what kind of timeline some of these undertakings demand. So you mentioned sort of the down payment in the rescue plan. Dr. Shuren at the top of this program talked about the FDA's efforts to address the pandemic. I think there was $500 million for the FDA in that bill. But you also mentioned, at length the infrastructure plan and how that's sort of broadly defined. It's not just those old bridges that our member companies rely on throughout the Commonwealth and New England, but it's really got an ambitious plan for non-physical infrastructure, research and development. Is calling out things like $50 billion for the National Science Foundation, specifically name checking biotechnology R&D. Also includes $40 billion to upgrade physical R&D infrastructure like laboratories. So I think that's, as you say, it's another bill that's going to involve a diverse and maybe every standing committee of jurisdiction in the Congress. It also deals a lot with manufacturing, calls for $50 billion to monitor the domestic industrial capacity and fund investments to support the domestic production of critical goods. it proposes more money for pandemic preparedness and resiliency, shoring up the national stockpile, speeding up the development of tests and therapeutics for emerging outbreaks and setting up the infrastructure for future outbreaks. Just making huge, thoughtful investments to try to limit the damage of a future pandemic like the one we're living through. He's put significant emphasis on growing high-tech manufacturing like medical devices, spreading good jobs from sort of these the regions that have seen tremendous growth in the last 20 or 30 years out to rural areas with some targeted investment and increasing access to capital. So as you said, I think it's truly an ambitious agenda, and it'll be interesting to see what Congress can make of it, and if we can meet that timeline of late July, I guess.
Yeah, no, just the sheer number of programs. I think, Anthony, you were talking about programs that span multiple committees of jurisdiction, and I think it's going to be similar to what happened the last go around with the American Rescue Plan. There's going to be a lot of committees involved, which means a lot of members have their fingerprints on the legislation. So it will be interesting to see exactly what that looks like at the end of the process, which again, hopefully by this summer. A couple of the other things that we are looking toward this summer, again, it's going to be very busy on the Hill. Appropriations. Every year we undertake a project basically to fund the entire federal government. And so, the president sent up his quote, we call it the skinny budget. It's not that skinny in terms of investments, it's actually rather bold, but it was kind of a pared down version of a major budget, which is normally what happens in a new administration as they're getting up and running. This administration obviously is dealing with the extra challenge of, the pandemic. So the Appropriations Committee has started their hearings with administration officials. They're taking input from members right now. They'll be turning all of that into legislation, and that will be marked up later this spring, early summer. We will be doing the Defense Authorization Bill, which authorizes defense programs and becomes somewhat of a large bill that also includes other priorities from members as well, just because the sheer size of it. And so all of that is going to happen before August recess, we think. So we will be very busy this summer.
Yeah, I think it bears mentioning that skinny budget. Doesn't really get into the FDA too deeply, but it does make a couple of interesting priorities public. Again, name checks the Strategic National Stockpile. I think it's almost $1 billion requested in the budget for this year. But interestingly, another $6.5 billion to establish ARPA-H, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health. I'm sure some of the members on here have worked with DARPA or others. I think this is pretty, it's pretty interesting. It indicates that the president's commitment, particularly to cancer, but other research and into other chronic diseases like diabetes or killers like Alzheimer's is still really high on his mind and something he's committed to. So it's just shows what you can do in the appropriations process outside of strictly legislating. We're running up on time. I don't see any questions that have come in, but please, by all means, if you do have some, feel free to email me or Brian or Rachel. We'll be sure to get back to you. Caitlin and I are happy to help and follow up with anybody that is looking for advice or counsel. I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel, I guess. I see her nodding.
Yes, thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Caitlin, so much for joining us. That was fantastic. We really do appreciate it, and we'll make sure that any questions get passed on to you guys.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, everybody, and thanks for having me today.
Thank you both. All right, we have one more session. I'm so glad to have so many of you stuck with us till the end, because I know you're going to learn a ton from this last presentation. I am happy now to turn things over to Trang Cox to walk us through all of the hoopla about remote audits and everything that the industry is going through right now. So Trang, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Rachel. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trang Cox, and I am excited to be sharing with you all about our Office of Medical Devices remote regulatory assessment. So let me go ahead and share my screen so you all can see the presentation.
Looks great.
Good? Perfect. All right, so I think you all are probably hearing from the other presenters, but COVID-19 has changed a lot of things for us, and I think mostly for the inspectional activities in March of 2020, we had to suspend surveillance inspections due to COVID, and that was for domestic and surveillance. And although we continued with mission critical inspections, but we did recognize that we needed a ongoing surveillance oversight for our routine work. And what we did, we at the time, we put a team together across the program with different, expertise. We had, boots on the ground CSOs all the way up to management, various SMEs, and we developed and launched our remote regulatory assessment, and that was in mid-February. So we're looking at almost 3 months in mid-May. So, and so far we're excited for it, and we're hoping that, you'll learn more about it today. So I guess you're asking, well, what is this? What is remote regulatory assessment? And I think I put in that voluntary word just as that. It's a voluntary process, and it's a remote review of records that you're required to maintain under the law and regulations. So we will be reviewing records and not really asking you to really maintain or generate anything besides what you already are maintaining and that you are required to already have in your system. And when we developed this process, we wanted it to be very thoughtful with it, and we wanted it to be a meaningful review. And so within that development, I think the big factor is that we wanted real-time engagement. We want it to be interactive. We wanted you to have that opportunity to, because we recognize the challenge of, record review remotely and not being able to really explain something or clarify, maybe a misunderstanding regards to records or procedures. So we wanted to allow for that real-time back and forth. And so it is developed into our process, and and we understand that it's meant to be fluid. So the other piece is also we wanted this RA to assist us in making regulatory decisions and prevent delays in critical decisions when inspectional data is not available. So that's another key piece. So let me kind of go through with the process. When we kind of identify the firms that now, we want you to participate in our voluntary RR process, you will then, the investigator or the CSO will contact your designated, firm representative. And in that initial contact, you will, the CSO will provide you with all the information you need and discuss, your ability and willingness. I think those are the two things. It's, are you willing? And then, of course, the other key piece is your ability. Just as you can imagine, the nature of it being remote, we will be requesting to review electronic records. So those are things to consider. You would need to provide electronic data. So if you're on a paper-based system, then that's something to consider. But of course, even after that, after the discussion, the investigator, once you're saying they're willing, they will also then send you a formal invitation letter with outlining, why we're doing this, what is this, maybe answer some other key questions, and then really allow you time to make that final decision to participate. And during any time, you could decline during that initial contact. You could decline after you got the invitation letter. you could be halfway and you can decline because it is a voluntary process. And so if you do agree and we proceed with it, the CSO will schedule your initial virtual meeting. And this process, it will just, the CSO will interview your staff about your products, your processes, your procedures. They will be requesting records review remotely. And these records can be provided via email. I think that's the simplified, historically been used. If you want some sort of encryption, we do actually have that secure email. You can send it via a secure email partner. For larger files, and some of you that are familiar with box.com, which is our cloud file sharing, you can also provide records via that mechanism, or WebTrader. So we're excited about WebTrader. If you're not familiar with WebTrader, WebTrader is a sister of eSubmitter. So eSubmitter is a system that you're probably familiar with that you're using to submit adverse event data to CDRH. So WebTrader is basically the sister of that, but this is used for our RA process. But if you're interested in in whichever avenue to securely transmit the data to us, which is an important piece for you and for us as well, just to discuss that with the CSO. And then there will just be follow-up meetings after the initial meetings as necessary to engage, to answer questions, and then we're full transparent. Any concerns will be clearly communicated by the CSO throughout, and then of course again at the closing to close out the RA. So let's talk about the benefits. It's always nice to know what are the benefits associated with these. So I think the most one that I want to highlight, probably the prominent one that you're interested in, is that your participation in the RA will be considered as part of our work planning activities. So, just like everything else, we look at the RA's outcome and then other factors and other sources. So if you complete an RA with no issues and then no other sources, then that definitely would be factored into our future work plan assignments. Another thing is it will also allow, for you all to identify potential minor or easily correctable deficiencies prior to future inspections. And of course, it's case by case, and we don't want to, really say we can predict, once there's an egregious finding, what is the next inspection, but definitely for the ones that are not significant and the CSO is able to, verbally discuss these findings with you as a result of the RA. This will allow you that time to, prevent and even, further refine and make your system more robust. So we think that would be a benefit. And also, I know for some industry, you're waiting for foreign government certificates, maybe for your industry contracts, things like that, where you need to provide some sort of regulatory standing. Maybe the RA can meet that need as well. And then for us, I'm going to state the obvious, but it will continue to allow us to do our important oversight responsibility in a safe fashion for our staff, for the public, and also for your staff, and keeping that in mind through doing these RAs remotely. And then again, it should help us in improving our efficiency and use of our resources. If for in the future also as well being able to do some sort of modernized blend or just certain firms where it would just make sense to do an RA. So what types of records, you're wondering? Well, what records are you going to request? Again, I think I was noting earlier, we're not going to request you to generate any records. So any records that are going to be reviewed during the RA process are records that you're required to be maintaining right now under the Act and the regulations. So those are the ones that and also because we were trying to streamline this when we're developing this process and trying to make it make it any more confusing. We're using a system-based approach. So a lot of, it's going to be the 4 main systems that you're familiar with. And then the specific records requests could vary due to the specific, maybe the project that you're handling, maybe to your specific situation of your firm. So let's say you're a design spec developer, then more than likely we'll probably do CAPA in design. And then just to wrap it up, we are not going to we're not going to ask you to generate any documents solely to support your engagement in the RA. So you're not supposed to, really create any videos for us. We're not going to ask you to generate some sort of system or procedures or process just to accommodate the RA. And this does not extend to you scanning the records into us, but we will not be asking you to do any of that. And then I definitely want to highlight, so what is the difference then between an RA and an inspection? So is there any key takeaways? First is that RAs are not inspections. It is that. It's remote regulatory assessment, and it will not replace, and it's not going to be equivalent to an inspection. Because it's not an inspection, we will not be issuing a 42, we will not be issuing a 43, and findings will be verbally discussed throughout, and again, during the closing to wrap up the RA. And the other, key takeaways, if anything else that, I want to you to take away is that they are voluntary. So, it requires you willing to participate, and then it's not an inspection. So the outcomes, so if there's any verbal discussions, you could respond in writing. And that's where we were trying to also make it streamlined with that, the process now where we don't come up with a new number of days and a different process just to make it more confusing. And it's the same, is that you have 15 days to respond to RRA as its completion of it. And it'll be going to CB compliance branch for, evaluations, for consideration, or any follow-up activities as necessary. But with anything that, our activity, FDA becomes aware of any violation of the law, we will use our administrative judicial actions necessary to ensure the safety of the public. But the same standards for evidence, policies determining when and if to take action will apply to any deficiencies identified during an RA. So we definitely strongly encourage your firm to respond to any verbal discussions within that timeline, and response should include corrective actions taken and a timeline for any additional corrective actions needed. And since it's not an inspection, again, you will not automatically receive a copy of the report per FMD 145. And also, it's not a report. We're documenting these per our memorandum. So copies of these memos can be requested through our Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. And if you're not familiar with it, you can go into our FDA.gov and just search up a FOIA request for more information. Frequently asked questions, I think these are some that were shared prior to this event, and just things that we include into our handout and things that we're hearing. So I want to address some of these frequently asked questions. So what happens if I do not want to participate or provide information documents? Again, voluntary participation, and you may decline to participate at any time, and it will not result in any regulatory action. And refusal to provide information during an RA is not a refusal under our inspection authority under Section 704 of the Act. The next one, how are FDA staff being trained for these activities? And we are training our staff with internal procedures guiding this process. So we provide them with the launch kickoff presentation. We've done updated presentations due to concerns that were brought to our attention. And we will continue to update and train our staff as the process evolves and experience is gained, in the implementation of this tool. And of course, as additional tools become available, we will ensure that our staff are appropriately trained. And then I think the other one, what does FDA expect these tools to be used in the future? So specifically for RA, we do expect RA to continue post-COVID as a regulatory tool. As I was mentioning earlier, a lot of thought, came in. We put a lot of thought into this and try to be a meaningful process so that we can, use it outside of COVID and not just within the realm of the pandemic. Then what can you do to prepare? There are several things. I think the first box is to determine if your firm can provide records electronically. I think just like I was mentioning, just the nature of it, we need those records electronically to review because we're not physically on site. And then, based on just, you can share screen, but just by the extension of that and having to do, a long session, it's just more efficient if it's, in electronic format for review, and being able to do that in a timely manner, and of course any limitations that you have to consider that. And familiarize yourself with platforms that can be used for these meetings and record submission. So right now we're using the standard ones that, right now, like we're using Zoom. We can use WebEx and we can use Microsoft Teams. And of course, if there's feedback or things that, as it evolves, I'm sure we will also adapt and update the procedure and process accordingly. But the records, just like I said, probably the simplified version is by email, and you can do it as a secured encryption process. If you have large files, we have Box, which is our cloud file sharing, and then this really exciting one that we're hopeful for is WebTrader. And then also just ensuring that your key staff are available and capable of joining meetings as needed. And I believe that wraps it up for my presentation. So I'll see if I have questions here. Okay, so I have a question here about if we identify deficiencies, major deficiencies, will the FDA enforce the actions? And as I noted, we will take actions against, if anything that violates the law, but it will still require the same form of evidence and require the same process. So our RA process right now, we're hoping, that this is not the mechanism for, significant concerns. So really, if we see a lot of findings, and really it's just not the right tool because we need to see the actual production, and it's a more involvement engagement where a real, an on-site inspection would probably meet the purpose of it, then we would terminate and try to complete it with a on-site inspection, just to ensure that, we give you that opportunity as well, just to really answer any major concerns and questions. And I see another one here. Would the RA assessment replace future inspection? No. So as I was saying before, our RAs will not replace and is not equivalent to inspection. And we're looking at ways, though, we don't know how long this, the situation will last. And we're looking at trying to be innovative and modernize inspection, but no, the RAs can't, I think just by the death of it, can't replace an inspection. Okay, can records be made available in a shared folder? Yes, so could you clarify? We use Box, and that's our cloud file sharing. We can't tap into other systems. It's just not approved right now. We vetted these options, which is email. You can do as a secure email partner, but with email, understanding that there's limitations to the file. So, if something that you can't send within 5-6 email and you have to really send a large file and there are numerous emails, and it's probably just the best way is to send it via Box.
Hey, Trang, it's Brian. Why don't I read the questions out for you so you don't have to do the double duty? Okay. How long? I want to take some stuff off your share. It's tough. How long is a typical RRA? All day, a few hours per day?
Yeah, so they're not supposed to be an all-day thing. We recognize that, no one wants to sit there for 8 hours, staring at a like this on a Zoom call. So we know your time is valuable, their time. So we're looking at probably a couple hours a day. Some of it would be where you would, have that interaction with the investigator. You would provide the requested records, and then the investigator would have their desk time to review it for the next meeting, and then have that engagement with your firm.
Great. Any roles suitable for a graduate student in RRA?
Any roles suitable for graduate students? As a CSO? I'm sorry, I'm understanding the question.
Maybe they can reach out to you, or maybe you should reach out to offline. So let's, are staff being trained on any specific electronic records platforms? Does this apply to anything in regulatory clearance or approval processes?
Yeah, so the 3 vetted platforms and way to securely transmit records right now, as was mentioned, is email. So you use that to send in your compliance responses. So this is not new. you send in, compliance responses to the CB email, and of course in conversation with the FDA. And then we also have DBox, which is our cloud file sharing, and we will have the CSO, provide all the instructions for you to set up and be able to share, your documents with us. And those are for large files. And then we're really excited about WebTrader, which is, we were testing it and now it's going live. So we're really hopeful for it, which is the sister, like I was saying, to eSubmitter, which is what you're using to submit adverse event through the web. So that definitely is a very hopeful option.
Great. How many RAs have been conducted approximately since the program was launched?
I believe we reach out to 80 something, and I'm pulling from, I think, mid-April. It's just from my memory because I just wrote that report recently. And this is from April 15th. I'm sorry, so it might not be exactly to the T, but we reach out to 83 firms, and there was 61% participation, 61%, I'm sorry, and we've completed 36 RAs so far.
Great. Is there an expectation to generate complaint MDR ECO records, or is that compliant? That might be compliant MDR ECO records.
So if you have those records, if you have it paper form, if you could scan that, but no, we don't expect you to generate something that you don't have. So either you already have a electronic system base where you can pull that. If it's paper-based, you can scan it, but maybe you can clarify. But of course, our expectations, we're not asking you to generate anything special that you don't have. Okay. But hopefully, if you with our system though, under CAPA and complaints, you have complaint records and MDRs.
We got a lot of questions, Trang. So why would a firm do RRA if it does not replace inspection?
Well, we have to put our best foot forward. Like right now, because of the pandemic and the nature and the concern, because like I said, your safety, our staff safety, and just the advisory nature of what's going on right now, we are doing on-site inspection with your willingness, but not to the scale that we were. So this is our best foot forward in this pandemic, is to complete them via the remote assessment process. They aren't equivalent to an RA, but like I said, they are factored into us when we are doing work planning. So if you complete an RA and there's no concerns, that would be a decision that we would make. We would probably not conduct another inspection unless there's poor cause.
Would allowing you access to our online-based QMS system to access the files work for file share?
So our procedures is in our QMIS system. So I'm trying to, but no, we can't tap into any file sharing system outside of Box.
Okay.
So, I think I know what that question is. Yeah, we can't tap into any other system.
Yeah, so they can't like give you access to their QMS software.
Yeah. Sorry, no.
Yeah, maybe in the future. What does success of this pilot look like?
The success is probably us just doing, what we can in the meantime amidst COVID, and then taking this further past COVID, and you participating. And I think in the end, it's that patient impact, is being able to have a meaningful system-based review that might not replace an inspection, because we can't be there to really, visualize, and walk through the production and have those, that type of level of oversight. But it's still, I feel it's meaningful in that we are still doing a very comprehensive review. And in the end, it's patient impact. It's about a better quality system and your engagement. And I know from hearing a lot that, we're not the first one off the gate doing RAs. All the other programs are looking into, similar or equivalent processes. And from what I'm hearing is that firms are also excited for us to be engaging and talking and just driving towards, the future, that we can still, do what we are, is to protect and promote public, and also you producing quality products amidst what's going on.
Great. So here's a question: how can we reach out to you offline? Are you receptive to some people reaching out to you from this program? How would they do that?
My name here, so it's Trang, Trang.Cox fda.hhs.gov.
Excellent. Okay, two more coming at you here. After FDA conveys the non-conformities/deficiencies verbally, does the company need to submit a formal response, just like the regular surveillance inspection?
Yes, so just like the inspections, you're not required to, but we do, we do suggest that you provide a response within 15 days, but you're not required to. But if you want it to be considered, but like I said, if it's where it's significant, we probably will not keep continuing through the RA process. But most of the findings, I think, you should be able to provide so for CB to make evaluations.
Excellent. Does an applicant have a choice to request a review from a particular firm?
I guess you can. I mean, there's nothing stopping you from maybe bringing your concerns or your requesting, but definitely we're not looking at it in any faulty situation. We're looking at this in just like we're work planning, we're pulling the firms that we would typically do an inspection, and we are doing it in RA, instead, because we can't be out full force doing an inspection, on-site inspection.
Great. Okay, here's the last question, Trang. Which FDA RRA requirements trigger the voluntary remote RA request? BIMO, site addition, etc. Which of those?
Yeah, so I can't really answer for the other programs. Ours does not cover for BIMO. So my apologies. You might have to go through the BIMO office. But for us, we don't have a trigger. Like I said, we have, criteria in that firms that we are usually doing RAs are probably in good standing. If you have a pending action or case or just things that would not make sense to do an RA, and we should probably do an inspection, we are not going to probably do an RA, but we would just still use our work planning process to conduct these RAs.
Excellent. Trang, you answered a lot of questions. You did so very well. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very informative. And that concludes our program today. Like I said, all this program content has been recorded, and we'll collect the slides that were presented, and we'll make those available to our attendees post-event. I want to thank all of our speakers, especially our friends from the FDA and our friends from industry, and our content partners, Viva MedTech, ML Strategies, RQM Plus, Covington and Burling, and Dwayne Morris, as well as our co-presenters of this event, ASQ Medical Device Division, New England Discussion Group, and RAPS Boston Chapter. On behalf of MassMEDIC and my colleague Rachel Robinson, I'm Brian Johnson. We are so thrilled that you spent this afternoon with us. We will be back on the 29th with an incredible town hall featuring House Ways and Means Committee Chair Richard Neal from Massachusetts' 1st District. So thank you for your time. Thank you to all our experts, and have a wonderful and safe day. Take care.